When justice fails, judgment comes. In the DC universe, a black envelope appears to those whom the system has failed. Inside, when justice fails, judgment comes. The architect is judge, jury, and executioner for those the law cannot touch. With powers similar to James Heller from Prototype 2, he shapeshifts through society's cracks, absorbing memories of the corrupt, learning their sins and then making them pay in blood. Loan sharks who burn families alive, cops who cover up grapes, politicians who poison children for profit, corporate executives who laugh at cancer victims. The architect hunts them all, leaving broken scales carved from their bones. But his brutal methods terrify even the Justice League. Superman questions his morals. Batman doubts his code. The Flash races to prevent judgments that maybe shouldn't be prevented. As corrupt networks fall one by one, heroes face an impossible choice. Stop the man who succeeds where they fail, or admit their mercy protects evil. The architect doesn't save the innocent, he avenges them. He doesn't reform the guilty, he erases them. In a world where heroes won't cross the line, someone must. The scales of justice are broken. He is the balance OC character. No reincarnation. Hello, everyone. Omni Sensei here with What If Prototype Antihero Was in DC Verse, Part 1. If you enjoy this content, please smash the like button. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it.
Chapter 1. Sarah's Suffering. The rain fell on Gotham's Lower East Side like tears from a broken sky, each drop carrying the weight of the city's sins down into the gutters where they belonged. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cold window of Mickey's diner, watching the water streak down the glass like the mascara that had run down her cheeks 3 hours ago. Her hands trembled as she counted the crumpled bills for the 7th time. $43.16. Not enough. Never enough. You gonna order something, lady, or just fog up my window all night? Mickey's voice cut short her thoughts. She looked up at the old owner, his face a roadmap of scars and disappointment. Even he looked at her with pity now, and that made everything worse. Coffee, she whispered. Just coffee. The hot liquid burned her tongue, but she welcomed the pain. It was better than the cold numbness that had settled into her bones over the past 6 months. 6 months since the accident. 6 months since the insurance company found their creative ways to deny her claim. 6 months since Vincent Torino had appeared at her door with his shark smile and his generous offer. Mrs. Martinez, I heard about your husband. Terrible thing, accidents like that. But you got bills, right? Medical bills? And little Sophia needs her medicine. Sophia. Her 8-year-old daughter was at home right now, probably doing homework at their kitchen table under the flickering light that Sarah couldn't afford to fix. The seizure medication alone cost $400 a month, and without David's income. Sarah's phone buzzed against the diner's table. The screen showed Vincent's number, and her stomach clenched like a fist. Hello? Sarah, sweetheart. Vincent's voice was smooth, but it carried a sharp edge to it. You missed our appointment today. I was at the hospital with Sophia. She had an episode, and that's touching, really. Family first, I always say. But business is business, and your payment was due yesterday. Sarah closed her eyes. I need more time. Just another week, I swear I'll have time. Vincent's laugh cracked like breaking glass. Honey, time is the one thing you can't afford. You owe me $12,000. Plus interest. Plus late fees. We're looking at 15 grand now. 15. The number hit her like a punch. But you said, I said a lot of things. What I'm saying now is simple. You pay by tomorrow night, or we start taking collateral. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone until the screen went black, her reflection staring back at her like a ghost. She thought about David, about the night shift at the chemical plant that was supposed to be routine, about the equipment malfunction that had filled his lungs with poison, about the insurance investigator who'd found David's signature on a waiver he'd never signed, about the way the plant manager had smiled when he told her there was nothing they could do. She thought about Sophia, about the seizures that came without warning, about the way her daughter's body would go rigid and her eyes would roll back until only the whites showed, about the bottles of pills that kept her alive and the bills that kept piling up, about Vincent Torino's hands on her shoulders 3 days ago, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered what would happen if she couldn't pay. The coffee had gone cold. Sarah left a $1 tip. Mickey needed it more than she did, and stepped back into the rain. The walk home took her through 5 blocks of rot, past boarded-up storefronts and apartments where the American dream went to die. She passed the burned-out shell of Chen's Market, where the Wong family had lived above their store until their protection payments fell behind. Vincent's boys had made an example of them. Gasoline was cheap, and screams carried far in the thin-walled apartments. Sarah's building sat on the corner, its windows mostly dark except for the flicker of candles or the blue glow of a TV. She climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled of piss and desperation, her keys jingling in the dark. Sophia was asleep at the kitchen table, her small face pressed against an open textbook. Math homework. Fractions. Sarah remembered helping her with the same problems last week, back when she still believed things might work out. She carried her daughter to bed, tucking the thin blanket around her narrow shoulders. Sophia stirred, her eyelids fluttering. "Mama." "Shoo, baby. Go back to sleep. Are we going to be okay?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah smoothed her daughter's dark hair, the same color David's had been. "Yes, sweetheart. Mama's going to fix everything." Sophia smiled and drifted back to sleep, trusting in the lie with the faith only children possessed. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the homework still scattered across its surface. Fractions. Parts of a whole. She thought about the fraction of a life they were living now, the fraction of justice they'd received, and the fraction of hope she had left. Outside, Gotham's night played its familiar tune, sirens in the distance, the rumble of elevated trains, and the occasional gunshot that might have been a backfire. The city didn't sleep, it just closed its eyes and pretended not to see. She opened her laptop, the ancient machine wheezing to life like a dying animal. The internet connection was spotty, but she managed to navigate to her email. Bills. Mostly. Overdue notices. A message from Sophia's school about the upcoming field trip she couldn't afford. And something else. The subject line was blank, the sender listed only as Final Court. Sarah frowned, her finger hovering over the delete button. Probably spam, or worse, another shark sensing her desperation like blood in the water. But something made her click it open. The message contained only an address, 1247 Bleecker Street, apartment 31B. Below that, a single line of text, "When justice fails, judgment comes." Sarah stared at the screen until her eyes watered. She'd never heard of Bleecker Street, but the words echoed in her mind like a prayer. When justice fails. She thought about David's insurance claim, denied on a technicality. About the plant manager's smirk. About Vincent Torino's hands and his promises of what tomorrow would bring. About fractions and the pieces of her life that were disappearing one by one. Sarah closed the laptop and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, in the maze of Gotham streets, Vincent Torino was probably counting money or breaking bones or planning which collateral he'd take first. Somewhere out there, the scales of justice sat rusted and broken, tipped so far toward the powerful that the weak couldn't even see them anymore. But somewhere out there, someone else was watching. Someone who understood that when the system failed, something else had to take its place. Sarah touched the glass, her fingertips leaving prints that would fade by morning. Tomorrow, Vincent would come for his payment. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between her daughter's medicine and her daughter's safety. Unless judgment came first. The rain continued to fall, washing the city's sins toward the river, where they would join all the others. In the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, marking the end of one day of suffering and the beginning of another. But in the darkness between the raindrops, something else was stirring. Something that had been watching and waiting and remembering every unpunished crime, every unanswered cry for help, and every broken scale on Lady Justice's blind eyes. Something that understood the difference between justice and vengeance. And didn't care. Chapter 2. Torino's Collection. Vincent Torino adjusted his gold watch and smiled at the sound of breaking bones. The basement of Torino's authentic Italian restaurant smelled like garlic, wine, and fresh blood, a combination that always made Vincent nostalgic for the old country, even though he'd been born in Newark. The restaurant upstairs served decent food to honest people who kept their mouths shut and paid their tabs. Down here, in the soundproof cellar his grandfather had built during Prohibition, Vincent served a different kind of meal. "Please," Marcus Chin whimpered through his shattered teeth. "I just need another week. The insurance money, It's coming, I swear, insurance money. Vincent let the words linger in his mouth. You know what I love about insurance, Marcus? It's all about risk assessment. And right now, you're looking like a very high-risk investment. Marcus was strapped to a dentist's chair Vincent had borrowed from a client who defaulted 3 months ago. Dr. Petrov had been quite the artist with his instruments before Vincent had fed him to the harbor. The chair was vintage, of solid construction, and had excellent restraint capabilities. Vincent appreciated quality craftsmanship. He selected a pair of needle-nose pliers from the surgical tray beside the chair. The metal gleamed under the harsh lights, spotless and eager. Now, let's talk mathematics, Vincent said, positioning the pliers around Marcus's left pinky finger. You borrowed $8,000. With interest and penalties, you now owe me $14,437. That's a lot of money for a man whose restaurant just burned down. It wasn't my fault. Marcus sobbed. You said if I paid the protection money, Vincent squeezed. The finger broke with a sound like a twig snapping when stepped on. Marcus's scream echoed off the stone walls, joining the symphony of suffering that had played in this basement for 3 generations. I said a lot of things, Vincent replied, moving to the ring finger. What I'm saying now is that you have 48 hours to come up with my money, or I start collecting in other ways. He gestured to the video camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking like a mechanical eye. Vincent had learned the power of documentation from his father, who'd learned it from his father. Fear was good, but recorded fear was a commodity that could be traded, sold, or leveraged for decades. My daughter, Marcus whispered. She's only 16. Please, don't what? Vincent's voice had the mock innocence of a child pulling wings off a fly. Don't document her contribution to your debt? Marcus. You're thinking like a victim instead of an entrepreneur. Your daughter is an asset. A very valuable asset, once we get her trained properly. He leaned closer, his breath warm against Marcus's ear. I have clients who pay premium rates for young talent. Especially the exotic types. Your little Amy, she's got that whole innocent schoolgirl thing going, doesn't she? Very marketable. Vincent straightened up and selected a different tool from the tray, a small, curved blade that Dr. Petrov had used for more delicate work. He tested its edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. Here's how this works, he continued, dabbing the blood on Marcus's forehead like a blessing. You have 2 days to bring me my money. If you can't, then Amy starts working for me. Don't worry, I'll take good care of her. Feed her regularly, make sure she gets her vitamins. We can't have the merchandise getting too thin. Marcus thrashed against the restraints, his face purple with rage and terror. You sick bastard. I'll kill you. I'll freaking kill you. Vincent laughed. With what? Your restaurant's ashes? Your empty bank account? Your broken fingers? He grabbed Marcus's chin, forcing him to look into his eyes. You're nothing, Marcus. Less than nothing. You're just another tale I'm going to tell to other clients when they get ideas about standing up to me. He stepped back and nodded to Tony Ricci, his favorite enforcer. Tony was built like a refrigerator with anger management issues, and he approached Marcus with the enthusiasm of a kid opening Christmas presents. Tony's going to escort you home, Vincent said, cleaning the blood from his blade with a monogrammed handkerchief. Make sure you understand the terms of our agreement. And Marcus? If you're thinking about running, don't. I have friends in a lot of places. Some of them wear badges. As Tony began untying Marcus from the chair, Vincent's phone buzzed. A text message from Detective Ray Morrison, Judge Morrison's nephew and Vincent's favorite pet on the GCPD payroll. Chin complaint filed. Will be lost in paperwork. Usual rate? Vincent typed back. Double rate. He's being difficult. The beauty of Gotham was its ecosystem. Everyone fed off everyone else, from the bottom feeders in the projects to the apex predators in City Hall. Vincent had spent 15 years cultivating his web, placing the right people in the right positions, learning which palms needed greasing and which throats needed cutting. Judge Morrison dismissed cases. Detective Morrison lost evidence. Commissioner Thane looked the other way. District Attorney Price found procedural errors. It was a symphony of corruption, and Vincent was its conductor. His phone rang. Unknown number, but Vincent recognized the pattern. 3 rings, hang up, call back. One of his street assets. Yeah. Mr. Torino? It's Danny. I got something you need to hear. Danny Kowalski was a junkie who sold information for fix money. Unreliable as a human being, but he had good ears and better survival instincts. Make it quick. That Martinez woman. The one with the sick kid. She's been asking around about lawyers. Pro bono types. Vincent's grip tightened on the phone. Sarah Martinez owed him $15,000, and she was due to pay tomorrow. The math was simple. She couldn't pay, so she'd become part of his collection. He'd already lined up 3 clients who were interested in her services. The grieving widow angle was very popular with a certain demographic. What kind of lawyers? The bleeding heart kind. Civil rights, wrongful death, that bullshit. Word is she's trying to reopen her husband's case. Vincent felt a familiar heat building in his chest. David Martinez had been a problem, asking too many questions about safety violations at the chemical plant and threatening to go to the EPA. Vincent's associates at Apex Chemical had paid good money to make that problem disappear, and they wouldn't appreciate having it resurface. Where is she now? Home. But boss, there's something else. She's been getting weird mail. Some kind of legal thing, but not from any lawyer I know. Real mysterious stuff. Vincent ended the call and stared at the wall, where his grandfather's portrait watched him with dead eyes. Salvatore Torino had built this empire with blood and bullets, carving out a piece of Gotham with only brutality. He'd understood that fear was the only currency that never inflated, the only investment that always paid dividends. But Salvatore had also understood that problems left unattended became cancers. And cancers had to be cut out before they spread. Vincent walked to his office safe and removed a leather-bound ledger, his grandfather's book, passed down through 3 generations of Torinos. Every debt, every favor, every life taken or spared was recorded in meticulous detail. Vincent flipped to the current entries, running his finger down the names until he found Sarah Martinez. Next to her name, he wrote, Accelerated Collection. Personal attention required. He closed the book and placed it back in the safe, then selected a clean knife from his collection. Each blade had a story. This one had opened Detective Morrison's first bribe envelope, and that one had carved up the last social worker who'd gotten too curious about missing kids. Tomorrow, a new blade would write a new story. Vincent checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. Sarah Martinez would be asleep, probably dreaming about her dead husband and her dying daughter. In a few hours, she'd wake up to a nightmare that would make her current problems seem like pleasant memories. He called Tony, who answered on the first ring. Boss. Change of plans. The Martinez woman needs a personal visit. At the earliest. You want me to bring the camera? Vincent smiled, the expression transforming his face into something that belonged in a medieval painting of hell. Bring everything. This is going to be a feature presentation. As he climbed the stairs from the basement, Vincent hummed an old Italian song his grandfather used to sing while working. It was about a shepherd who protected his flock from wolves, no matter the cost. The song had a beautiful melody, but Vincent had always preferred the verses about what happened to the wolves. Behind him, the basement fell silent except for the steady drip of water and the occasional creak of old bones. The walls had absorbed decades of screams, confessions, and final prayers. They were good walls, thick, soundproof, and discreet. Soon, they would have new stories to absorb. Vincent adjusted his tie and stepped into the Gotham night, where the rain had finally stopped and the stars were hidden behind clouds like witnesses afraid to testify. The city sprawled around him, full of people who owed him money, favors, or fear. All of them would pay their debts, one way or another. It was just good business. Chapter 3. The Smiling Judge. Judge Harold Morrison had always believed that justice was like fine wine. It improved with age, and it was always better when you could afford the good stuff. He sat behind his mahogany desk in chambers, reading through the morning's docket while sipping coffee from a mug that read World's Greatest Uncle. The irony wasn't lost on him. His nephew Ray had given him the mug last Christmas, shortly after Harold had made his 3rd DUI disappear from the books. Family was important, after all. Blood was thicker than evidence. A soft knock interrupted his morning ritual. Margaret Henley, his clerk, peered through the doorway with the same nervous expression she'd worn for the past 3 years. Your Honor, the Martinez case is on today's calendar. Wrongful death civil suit. Harold set down his coffee and opened the thick file. Sarah Martinez versus Apex Chemical Industries. The woman was trying to sue over her husband's death, claiming negligence and cover-up. Harold had read through the paperwork twice, once to understand the case, and once to figure out how to kill it. Ah yes, the grieving widow. Harold's smile was the same one he used when sentencing teenagers to juvie for possession while their dealers walked free. What's the status on the Apex documentation? Sealed by court order, Your Honor. As you requested. Excellent. And the EPA inspection reports? Ruled inadmissible due to procedural violations. Harold nodded approvingly. Margaret had learned well over the years. When he'd first inherited her from Judge Patterson, she'd been idealistic and thorough. Now she understood that thoroughness was a luxury that few could afford. The toxicology report? Lost in evidence storage, Your Honor. Detective Morrison filed the report, but there seems to have been a clerical error. How unfortunate. Harold's fingers drummed against the desk in a rhythm that matched the tick of his grandfather's clock. And Mrs. Martinez's attorney? Public Defender. Maria Vatz from the Legal Aid Society. Harold almost laughed. Maria Vatz was fresh out of law school and probably still believed in truth and justice and all those other fairy tales they taught in constitutional law. She'd walk into his courtroom with a briefcase full of righteous indignation and walk out with a lesson in how the real world worked. Schedule the hearing for 10:30. And Margaret? Make sure we have good court security today. Grieving widows can be emotional. As Margaret retreated, Harold opened his personal phone and scrolled through his messages. 3 new transfers from his Cayman account, courtesy of Apex Chemicals' legal department. A reminder about his nephew's promotion ceremony. And a text from Vincent Torino, Judge, need Martinez case buried deep. Worth $50K to right decision. Harold deleted the message and smiled. Vincent was crude but efficient, and his money was as green as anyone else's. The beauty of Gotham's legal system was its flexibility. Justice might be blind, but she wasn't deaf to the sound of cash registers. The morning dragged on with the usual mix of misery and corruption. Harold sentenced a homeless veteran to 6 months for sleeping in a doorway while dismissing assault charges against a city councilman's son. He approved a search warrant that violated the Fourth Amendment 7 different ways while denying a motion to suppress evidence that had been obtained through obvious police brutality. It was a good day at the office. At 10:25, Harold took his place on the bench, his black robes flowing around him like the wings of a carrion bird. The courtroom was nearly empty, a few law students, some court reporters, and the parties involved. Sarah Martinez sat at the plaintiff's table next to her young attorney, her hands folded in her lap like a woman praying for miracles. Harold had stopped believing in miracles around the time he'd started accepting bribes. All rise for the Honorable Harold Morrison, presiding. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom as Harold settled into his chair. He enjoyed this moment, the ritual of power, the way everyone stood and waited for his permission to sit. It reminded him why he'd wanted to be a judge in the first place, back when he'd still believed his own campaign speeches about serving justice. Be seated. We are here today for the matter of Martinez versus Apex Chemical Industries. Is the plaintiff ready to proceed? Maria Vatz stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled through her notes. Yes, Your Honor. We are prepared to present evidence that Apex Chemical Industries, objection. The voice belonged to Richard Blackstone, Apex's lead attorney. Blackstone was everything Maria Vatz wasn't: expensive, experienced, and utterly without conscience. Harold had worked with him on dozens of cases over the years, and the man was worth every penny of his $1,000 hourly rate. Mr. Blackstone, the plaintiff hasn't even finished her opening statement. Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal. The plaintiff's case relies entirely on evidence that has been ruled inadmissible, testimony from witnesses who refuse to appear, and documentation that violates our client's proprietary rights. Harold pretended to consider this, stroking his chin thoughtfully. In the gallery, Sarah Martinez leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed on him with desperation and hope. Her daughter wasn't in court, probably at school, or maybe at home having another seizure while her mother fought for justice that would never come. Ms. Vats, how do you respond? The young lawyer stood again, her voice stronger now. Your Honor, our case is built on solid evidence of negligence and deliberate cover-up. David Martinez died because Apex Chemical failed to maintain proper safety protocols. The toxicology report clearly shows. What toxicology report? Harold's voice cut short her words. I don't see any toxicology report in the evidence file. It was submitted 3 weeks ago, Your Honor. Detective Morrison took the blood samples personally. Harold made a show of shuffling through papers, even though he knew exactly where the report was, courtesy of his nephew's attention to detail. I'm afraid there's no such report in the court record, Ms. Vats. Perhaps you could refresh my memory about this alleged evidence. Maria Vats' face went pale. She fumbled through her briefcase, pulling out folders and loose papers with increasing desperation. I have copies, Your Honor. Right here. Copies of what, Ms. Vats? Without chain of custody documentation and the original samples, what exactly are you presenting to this court? Harold watched the young lawyer's world crumble in real time. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, her carefully prepared case dissolving into legal quicksand. Behind her, Sarah Martinez gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white with tension. Your Honor, Maria Vats said, her voice barely above a whisper, surely we can request new samples, from a body that's been cremated? Blackstone's voice mocked her. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of desperate fishing expedition that wastes the court's time and taxpayer money. Harold nodded gravely. I'm inclined to agree, Mr. Blackstone. Ms. Vats, do you have any admissible evidence to present? The silence stretched like a torture rack. Maria looked at her notes, at her client, and at the empty gallery where justice was supposed to sit. Finally, she shook her head. No, Your Honor. Then I have no choice but to grant the defendant's motion for dismissal. Harold's gavel came down like a gunshot. Case dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiff is ordered to pay court costs. The sound that came from Sarah Martinez wasn't quite a scream, more like the noise a wounded animal makes when it realizes the trap won't open. She stood up slowly, her face a mask of disbelief and devastation. Your Honor, she said, her voice cracking, my husband is dead. My daughter is dying. They killed him, and you're letting them walk away. Harold's expression didn't change. Mrs. Martinez, I understand you're grieving, but this court deals in evidence, not emotions. If you have new, admissible evidence, you're welcome to file a new suit. With what money? Sarah's voice rose to a shriek. I can't even afford my daughter's medicine. They destroyed everything, and you're helping them. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand moving to his taser. Harold held up a hand to stop him. The woman was no threat, just another broken piece of Gotham's machinery. Mrs. Martinez, I suggest you compose yourself. Outbursts like this won't bring your husband back or help your daughter. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her footsteps sounding like a funeral march. Harold waited until the room cleared before allowing himself a small smile. Another case closed, another check deposited, another day in the life of Gotham's most flexible judge. He gathered his files and prepared to return to chambers, already thinking about his lunch appointment with Vincent Torino. His phone buzzed as he reached his office. A text from an unknown number. Justice may be blind, but judgment sees everything. Harold frowned and deleted the message. Probably some crank who'd been following the case. Gotham was full of bleeding hearts who thought the system owed them something. They'd learn, eventually, that the system only owed you what you could afford to buy. He opened his safe and pulled out a leather-bound ledger that matched the one Vincent kept. 3 generations of Morrisons had sat on Gotham's benches, and 3 generations had understood that justice was a business like any other. Supply and demand, profit and loss, winners and losers. Harold opened the ledger to today's date and wrote, Martinez versus Apex, dismissed. Payment received. Case closed. But as he locked the ledger away, something nagged at him. The text message had felt different somehow, not desperate or angry like the usual crank mail, but cold and certain. Like a diagnosis from a doctor who'd already seen your x-rays. Harold shook off the feeling and straightened his tie. He had 3 more cases this afternoon, all of which would require his special attention. A grape case where the victim was poor and the defendant was rich. A drug trafficking charge where the suspect had friends in City Hall. A child abuse case where the social worker had asked too many questions. It was going to be another profitable day in paradise. Outside his window, Gotham stretched out like a cancer under the gray sky. Somewhere in that maze of suffering and corruption, Sarah Martinez was walking home to tell her dying daughter that justice was a luxury they couldn't afford. But somewhere else in that same maze, something was watching and waiting and remembering every unpunished crime, every denied appeal, every time the scales of justice had been rigged by men like Harold Morrison. Something that understood the difference between law and justice, and had already chosen which side it served. Chapter 4: Interest Compounding. Vincent Torino received the news of Judge Morrison's ruling while he was having lunch at his favorite restaurant in the evening, the same one where he'd broken Marcus Chen's fingers 12 hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him as he cut into his steak, the meat tender and pink under his knife. "Beautiful work, Your Honor," he said into his phone, watching the blood pool on his plate. "Clean, efficient, and permanent. Everything I appreciate in a business partner." Judge Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of a job well done. "The case is dismissed with prejudice, Vincent. She can't refile, and she can't appeal. It's buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa. And the court costs $1,800. Due immediately, or we can start garnishing what's left of her assets." Vincent smiled and took another bite of the steak. The meat practically dissolved on his tongue, seasoned with the tears of his enemies. "Add it to her tab. I'll be collecting everything she owes tonight." After hanging up, Vincent opened his tablet and reviewed the Martinez file. Sarah Martinez now owed him $15,000 in principal, plus interest, plus court costs, plus the penalty fees he'd be adding for her attempt to circumvent their agreement through legal channels. The total came to $19,847. It was a beautiful number, large enough to be impossible, specific enough to sound official, and devastating enough to destroy what was left of her pathetic life. Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from Tony Ricci. "Package delivered. Clean entry. No witnesses. Perfect." While Sarah had been in court watching her last hope die, Tony had been busy at her apartment, installing the surveillance equipment and preparing the collection site. Vincent believed in being thorough. When you owned someone's life, you needed to document every moment of their destruction. He finished his steak and drove to the Martinez apartment building, a festering sore on Gotham's Lower East Side. The building superintendent, a tweaker named Eddie who owed Vincent $3,000 in gambling debts, had provided the keys and the security codes. Everyone in this neighborhood was either a customer, a debtor, or future merchandise. Vincent climbed to the 3rd floor, his Italian leather shoes silent on the stained carpet. The hallway smelled like piss and broken dreams, but Vincent had grown up in places like this. He understood that poverty was a business opportunity, and desperation was the most renewable resource in Gotham. He knocked on the apartment with a gentle tap of a concerned neighbor. "Mrs. Martinez? It's Vincent. I heard about the court case. I thought you might want to discuss our arrangement." The silence stretched for 30 seconds before the door opened a crack, still secured by the chain lock. Sarah's eye appeared in the gap, red-rimmed and hollow with exhaustion. "I told you, I need more time. The case is over, I know." Vincent finished. "Dismissed with prejudice. No appeal possible. And now you owe court costs on top of everything else." He held up his tablet, showing her the updated balance. $19,847. Plus today's interest, of course. Sarah's face went white. "That's impossible. You said 15,000. I said a lot of things. What I'm saying now is that your debt has compounded. Legal fees, penalties for attempting to breach our contract, and emotional distress for the trouble you've caused me." Vincent's smile was sharp. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to offer you a payment plan." "What kind of payment plan?" Vincent gestured to the chain lock. "Why don't you invite me in? This conversation requires privacy." Sarah hesitated, torn between her maternal instincts and desperation. Finally, she released the chain and stepped back. Vincent entered the apartment, noting the placement of Tony's hidden cameras, the reinforced door locks, and the strategic positioning of his men in the building's stairwells. The apartment was a shrine to poverty, thrift store furniture, generic groceries, and the pervading smell of fear. Sofia Martinez sat at the kitchen table, working on homework while an 4 drip-fed medication into her thin arm. She looked up as Vincent entered. Her dark eyes were curious but unafraid. "Mama, who's the man in the fancy suit?" "A friend of Mama's, sweetheart. Keep working on your math." Vincent studied the child with the interest of a livestock appraiser. 8 years old, underdeveloped due to malnutrition, but she had potential. The medical condition was actually a selling point for certain clients. They enjoyed the power dynamic of complete dependency. "Beautiful daughter," Vincent said, his voice carrying undertones that made Sarah's skin crawl. "She has your eyes." "Don't." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Please don't." Vincent sat down on the couch without invitation, crossing his legs and making himself comfortable. "Mrs. Martinez, let's discuss your options. Option 1, you pay me the total by midnight tonight." "I don't have that kind of money. You know I don't." "Option 2, you begin working for me to pay off your debt. I have several business ventures that require female participation. The work is demanding, but the pay is regular." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "I won't." Option 3, Vincent continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Sofia joins my youth development program. I have clients who are very interested in sponsoring promising young girls. They provide housing, education, and all necessary medical care." The medication drip made a soft clicking sound as it fed life into Sofia's veins. The child continued working on her math, unaware that her future was being bartered in the next room. "You're talking about selling my daughter," Sarah said, her voice hollow with horror. "I'm talking about providing opportunities," Vincent corrected. Sofia would have access to private medical care, tutoring, and social connections that could benefit her for life. Some of my youngest alumni have gone on to very successful careers. He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo, a teenage girl in an expensive dress, smiling at a camera while an older man's hands rested possessively on her shoulders. "This is Amanda. She started working for me when she was 10. Now she's 17 and engaged to a very prominent businessman. Her medical bills? Taken care of. Her education? Private school and college prep. Her future? Secured." Sarah stared at the photo, seeing past the expensive dress and makeup to the emptiness in the girl's eyes. "How many others?" "Enough to know what works." Vincent pocketed the phone and checked his watch. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Martinez. I don't make money from damaged goods. My girls are well cared for, well educated, and well protected. They live better than they ever would have in places like this." He gestured around the apartment with obvious distaste. "Look at your daughter's future here. Malnutrition, substandard education, and progressive medical deterioration. She'll be dead before she's 16, or worse, she'll survive and end up like you. What's that supposed to mean?" Vincent's smile became dangerous. "Desperate. Broken. Begging men like me for mercy that doesn't exist." Sofia looked up from her homework, sensing the tension in the room. "Mama? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby. Keep working." Vincent stood and walked to the kitchen table, looming over the child like a well-dressed predator. "What are you studying, sweetheart?" "Fractions," Sofia replied, her voice small but not afraid. "I'm trying to figure out 3/4 of 24. 18, Vincent said immediately. 3/4 of 24 is 18. You take the whole number and multiply it by the numerator, then divide by the denominator." Sofia's face lit up with understanding. "Oh. So if I want half of 16, I multiply 16 by 1 and divide by 2. "Exactly. You're a very smart girl, Sofia. Smart girls do well in my programs." Sarah moved quickly, putting herself between Vincent and her daughter. "Get away from her." "I'm just helping with homework," Vincent said innocently. "Education is important. It opens doors that might otherwise remain closed." He returned to the couch and checked his watch again. "It's now 2:30 p.m. You have 9.5 hours to make your decision. Option 1, Option 2, or Option 3. But Mrs. Martinez. His voice hardened to steel. You will choose one of them. The alternative is unpleasant. What alternative? Vincent's smile vanished, replaced by something that belonged in nightmares. I'll burn this building down with both of you inside. Then I collect on your life insurance and call it a day. The apartment fell silent except for the click of Sophia's Ford drip and the distant sound of sirens in the Gotham afternoon. Vincent let the silence stretch, watching Sarah's face cycle through horror, despair, and finally, acceptance. I need time to think. You have 9.5 hours. Not a minute more. Vincent stood and straightened his tie. I'll return at midnight for your answer. I suggest you use the time wisely. He walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Mrs. Martinez? Don't even think about running. I have people watching this building, your daughter's school, and every hospital in the city. You're in my ecosystem now, and in here, the strong survive by eating the weak. Vincent left the apartment and walked down the hallway, humming the same Italian song his grandfather used to sing. Behind him, he could hear Sarah Martinez crying, not the angry tears of defiance, but the broken sobs of complete defeat. His phone buzzed with a message from Tony, building secured. All exits covered. Martinez package ready for midnight collection. Vincent replied, excellent. Prepare both scenarios. I want options. As he descended the stairs, Vincent thought about fractions. 3/4 of 24 was indeed 18. 3/4 of a life was about 57 years. 3/4 of a childhood was about 13 years. Sophia Martinez was 8 years old. That meant she had approximately 5 years of childhood left to enjoy, assuming she lived that long. Vincent planned to make the most of those remaining fractions. He stepped out into the Gotham afternoon, the sun struggling and failing to cut through the smog. The city sprawled before him like a feast, broken families, desperate parents, and children about to learn that innocence was just another thing to be bought and sold. Vincent adjusted his gold watch and smiled. In a few hours, he would collect his payment in full, one way or another. The scales of justice might be broken, but the scales of commerce were working perfectly. Business was good. Chapter 5. The Black Envelope. Sarah Martinez sat on her daughter's bed, watching Sophia sleep fitfully under the thin blanket. The Ford drip continued its mechanical rhythm, feeding precious medication into her daughter's failing body. Each drop cost 57 cents. Sarah had done the math obsessively, calculating how many drops they could afford and how many days of life she could buy with the money she didn't have. The apartment was silent except for Sophia's labored breathing. Sarah had triple-checked the locks after Vincent left, but she knew they were meaningless. He owned this building, this neighborhood, and probably half the cops who would respond if she called for help. 3 options, she thought, her mind cycling through Vincent's ultimatum like a broken record. Sell herself. Sell Sophia. Or die. The clock on Sophia's nightstand read 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until Vincent returned for her answer. 13 minutes to choose which nightmare would consume what was left of their lives. Sarah stood and walked to the kitchen window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. 3 stories below, she could see Tony Ricci's car parked across the street, its occupant smoking a cigarette while he waited. 2 more of Vincent's men waited in the building's lobby, and another one patrolled the alley behind the building. A perfect box with no way out. She thought about David, about the night shift that was supposed to be routine. About the way he'd kissed her goodbye and promised to fix the leaky faucet when he got home. About the call from a hospital at 3:17 a.m. and the doctor's hollow voice explaining that David's lungs had been destroyed by chemicals that weren't supposed to be in the air he breathed. About the insurance investigator who'd smiled while explaining why David's death wasn't covered. About the plant manager who'd shrugged and said accidents happened. About Judge Morrison's gavel coming down like a hammer on her family's coffin. About Vincent Torino's hands on her shoulders and his breath in her ear as he whispered what he planned to do to Sophia. Sarah opened her laptop with trembling fingers. She navigated to her email, scrolling through the collection notices and medical bills until she found the message that had arrived 3 days ago. From Final Court Subject, blank, when justice fails, judgment comes. 1247 Bleecker Street, Apartment 3B. Sarah stared at the address. She'd never heard of Bleecker Street, but something about the message felt different from the usual spam. When justice fails. Justice had failed. Spectacularly, completely, with the thoroughness of a system designed to protect men like Vincent Torino and Judge Morrison while grinding people like her into dust. The courts had failed her. The police had failed her. God had failed her. But maybe judgment was different. Sarah grabbed her phone and typed the address into her GPS. Bleecker Street was in the old industrial district, a 5-minute walk through the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and streetlights had a habit of going dark. She looked at Sophia, still sleeping under the medication's influence. Moving her would be dangerous. The 4 couldn't be interrupted, and the seizures were worse when her routine was disrupted. But leaving her here. Sarah's hand shook as she composed a text message. I need help. Vincent Torino. 19K debt. Midnight deadline. They want my daughter. She stared at the words for 30 seconds, then added, when justice fails, judgment comes. She sent the message to the email address, hoping whoever operated the final court monitored their communications. Then she kissed Sophia's forehead and whispered, Mama will be right back, baby. I'm going to fix everything. Sarah slipped out of the apartment, leaving the lights on and the TV playing so Vincent's watchers would think she was still inside. The hallway was empty, but she could hear the murmur of voices from the stairwell, Vincent's men, probably playing cards while they waited for midnight. She climbed to the roof access, a route she discovered during her first desperate week in the building. The door was supposed to be locked, but the superintendent had broken the mechanism years ago and never bothered to fix it. The neighboring building was only 6 feet away, separated by an alley that dropped 4 stories to the dumpsters below. Sarah had never been athletic, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She backed up, sprinted forward, and leaped across the gap. Her landing was graceful as a car accident, her knees slamming into the gravel roof hard enough to draw blood. But she was across, invisible to the men watching her building. Sarah limped to the roof access and descended into a building that smelled like mold and abandonment. The streets of the industrial district were darker than the rest of Gotham, lit only by the occasional flickering streetlight and the glow from factory windows. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the brick walls as she followed her phone's GPS through a maze of loading docks and chain-link fences. 1247 Bleecker Street turned out to be a converted warehouse, its windows dark except for a single light on the 3rd floor. The building looked abandoned, but the front door was unlocked. Sarah climbed 3 flights of stairs that creaked under her weight, each step taking her further from the world she knew and closer to something that might be salvation or damnation. Apartment 31B had no nameplate, just a number painted in fading white letters. Sarah raised her hand to knock, then noticed the envelope. It was black as midnight, sealed with dark red wax that looked like dried blood. Her name was written across the front in elegant script that seemed to flow like liquid silver. Underneath her name, in smaller letters, were the words, "The final court is now in session." Sarah's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavy and expensive, with words that seemed to burn themselves into her mind. Sarah Martinez, your petition for justice has been received and reviewed. The crimes against your family have been documented. The corruption that protects your enemies has been catalogued. The debt of blood they owe has been calculated with interest. Vincent Torino, Judge Harold Morrison, Detective Ray Morrison, Captain James Hayes, Plant Manager Robert Cross, Insurance Investigator Maria Santos, and 17 others have been marked for collection. Justice has failed. Judgment will not. Return to your daughter. Protect her until dawn. When the sun rises, your debts will be forgiven and your enemies will be gone. The scales will be balanced. Do not look for us. Do not speak of us. Do not thank us. We are the shadow cast by broken scales. We are the price of unanswered prayers. We are inevitable. The Architect. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to process the words. 17 others? How did they know about Maria Santos, the insurance investigator who'd buried David's claim? How did they know about Captain Hayes, who'd refused to investigate David's death? How did they know anything? A sound from the hallway made her look up, footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the stairs. Sarah folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, then tried the door to apartment 3B. It was unlocked. The apartment was empty except for a single chair facing the window that overlooked her neighborhood. On the windowsill sat a small pair of scales, the kind lawyers kept on their desks as decorative reminders of justice. But these scales were broken, Their balance arms snapped in half and their weighing pans scattered on the floor. Sarah approached the window and looked out over Gotham. In the distance, she could see her building, Vincent's men still positioned around it like pieces on a chessboard. The clock on her phone showed 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until Vincent came for his answer. But as Sarah watched, something moved in the shadows between the buildings. A figure that seemed like flowing shadow, too large to be human but moving with human purpose. It approached Tony Ricci's car slowly, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. The figure reached the car and paused, as if sensing her observation. For a moment, it looked up at her window, and Sarah glimpsed something that might have been eyes, cold, patient, and absolutely certain. Then the figure dissolved into shadow, and Tony Ricci's cigarette went out. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message: "Stay inside. Lock your doors. Don't let Sophia see." Sarah ran for the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The letter crinkled in her pocket as she descended, the words echoing in her mind: "When the sun rises, your debts will be forgiven and your enemies will be gone." She retraced her route through the industrial district at a dead run, leaping back across the alley gap with desperation. By the time she reached her apartment, it was 12:02 a.m., and Vincent Torino started knocking on her door. "Mrs. Martinez? Time's up. I hope you've made your decision." Sarah stood in her hallway, breathing hard, the black envelope's message burning in her pocket. She could hear Vincent's voice through the door. Behind her, Sophia stirred in her sleep, the foredrip continuing its life-giving rhythm. "I'm thinking," Sarah called out, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Vincent's laugh sounded through the door. "Thinking time is over, sweetheart. Open the door." Sarah walked to Sophia's bedside in her room and sat down, placing her hand on her daughter's forehead. The fever had broken. For the first time in weeks, Sophia's skin felt cool and normal. "Mrs. Martinez." Vincent's voice carried an edge of irritation. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah looked at the broken scales on her nightstand, a gift from David when she'd been considering law school, back when they believed justice was more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The scales had been gathering dust for months, their balance arm bent from a fall. But now, somehow, they seemed different. Not broken, transformed. Outside, the night held its breath and waited for judgment to fall. "I'm not opening the door," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Vincent's patience finally cracked. "Then I'm coming through it." The door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire apartment. Vincent stepped through the wreckage, flanked by Tony Ricci and 2 other men. But as they crossed the threshold, the lights went out. Chapter 6: Hunter's Arrival. The darkness that took Vincent Torino's crew wasn't natural. It moved with purpose, sliding around the broken doorframe like a shadow with hunger. The hallway's emergency lights flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving only the pale glow of Sophia's 4 monitor to light the nightmare ahead. Vincent fumbled for his phone's flashlight, his usual confidence starting to crack. "Tony, what the hell?" The words died in his throat as something impossible unfolded from the shadows near the ceiling. The architect had been watching Vincent for 3 days, studying every entrance, every routine, and every weakness. He'd learned their patterns the way a spider learns the vibrations of its web, intimately, patiently, with the promise of inevitable death. But seeing them from the shadows was different from meeting them in the flesh. The architect dropped from the ceiling, his form still shifting between human and something far more dangerous. In the dim light, Vincent could see broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, arms that seemed too long for any human frame, and hands that ended in fingers capable of becoming claws, blades, or worse. "Vincent Torino," the architect said, his voice producing sounds that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "The scales are broken. Time to balance the books." Tony Ricci, to his credit, went for his gun. The motion was smooth and professional, the result of 15 years of collecting debts for the Torino family. His .45 cleared leather and was rising toward the target when the architect moved. The superhuman speed wasn't flashy like the heroes Vincent had seen on TV. There were no blurred afterimages or sonic booms. The architect simply wasn't where Tony was aiming, and then he was behind Tony, one impossibly strong hand covering the gunman's mouth while the other transformed into something that belonged in butcher shops, not human bodies. The blade that emerged from the architect's wrist was bone white and sharp enough to part steel. It slid between Tony's ribs easily, finding the heart in a single thrust. Tony's eyes widened in shock, then went glassy as the architect held him upright for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the others to understand what they were facing. "Anthony Ricci," the architect whispered into the dying man's ear. 12 counts of aggravated assault. 6 counts of sexual battery. 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree. Sentence: death by cardiac puncture. He released Tony's body, letting it crumple to the floor with the wet sound of meat hitting tile. The gun clattered away into the darkness, suddenly useless as a paperweight. Vincent's 2 remaining men, Bobby Torino, one of his worthless nephew, and Marcus Webb, a leg breaker from the old neighborhood, pressed against the wall like cornered rats. Both were armed, both had killed before, and both were discovering that courage was much easier to find when beating helpless victims than when facing something that strong. "You boys want to run," the architect observed, tilting his head with curiosity. "But you know Vincent will kill you if you abandon him. Interesting loyalty dynamics. Let me simplify your decision." The architect's right arm extended like a striking snake, transforming mid-motion into a tentacle of living biomass. It wrapped around Bobby's throat and lifted him off the ground, his feet kicking frantically at empty air. The tentacle's surface rippled, and Bobby's struggles became weaker as it began to feed. "Bobby Torino," the architect said conversationally, ignoring Bobby's gurgling attempts to scream. "Aggravated battery of a minor. Conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Accessory to murder. And..." The tentacle pulsed, and Bobby's memories flooded into the architect's consciousness like a river of filth. "Ah. That's disappointing. Even for a Torino." The feeding process was obscene in its intimacy. Bobby's face went from red to purple to gray as the architect absorbed not just his life force but also his memories, his knowledge, and his accumulated experiences of cruelty and cowardice. When the tentacle finally released him, Bobby's body hit the floor like an empty suit of clothes. But the architect was no longer just himself. Bobby's memories had shown him the location of 3 more safe houses, the names of 17 additional victims, and the details of a trafficking operation that stretched from Gotham to Coast City. Each absorbed mind made him more dangerous, more knowledgeable, and more certain of his version of justice. Marcus Webb broke first. The leg breaker who'd crippled a dozen shopkeepers for late payments turned and ran for the broken door, his nerve finally snapping like an overextended cable. He made it exactly 6 steps before the architect's other arm caught him, transforming into a whip of living tissue that wrapped around Marcus's waist and yanked him back into the apartment. "Marcus Webb," the architect said, reeling his catch in like a fisherman. "Assault with a deadly weapon. Extortion. Conspiracy to commit rape." He paused as Marcus's feet left the floor. "And such creative uses for that crowbar. How did you sleep at night?" "Please," Marcus gasped, his tough guy facade crumbling like wet sand. "I got kids. Men. The architect's grip tightened, and Marcus's ribs began to crack with sounds like breaking branches. "You have 3 children. Marcus Jr., age 12. Rebecca, age 9. Timothy, age 6. You beat them regularly. You've been selling Rebecca's photographs to Vincent's clients. You used Timothy as collateral for gambling debts." Marcus's face went white as his darkest secret spilled from the architect's lips. "How do you..." Bobby was very thorough in his documentation. "Child Services will be collecting your offspring tomorrow morning. They'll go to families that won't use them as currency." The architect's grip shifted, and Marcus felt his spine compress. The pain was indescribable, not just physical, but existential, as if his very soul was being pressed into diamond by unstoppable pressure. "Sentence," the architect continued, his voice patient as a teacher explaining math to a slow student. "Death by compression fracture of the cervical vertebrae." Marcus's screams cut off with a snap of breaking bone. Vincent Torino stood alone in the apartment, surrounded by the corpses of his crew and face-to-face with something that made his worst nightmares seem like children's bedtime stories. The lone shark who'd built his reputation on being the scariest thing in any room discovered what true fear felt like. "Vincent Torino," the architect said, turning his full attention to the trembling man. "Age 42. Net worth approximately $2.3 billion, most of it earned through usury, human trafficking, and brutalization of the poor. Married to Elena Torino, who knows exactly what you do and profits from it. 2 children, Vincent Jr., age 10, and Maria, age 14. The architect stepped closer, his form shifting subtly as the absorbed biomass integrated with his existing structure. He was larger now and more imposing. Your son deals drugs at his private school. Your daughter has been prostituting herself to pay for your wife's gambling addiction. Your family is as diseased as you are, Vincent. Corruption breeding corruption, generation after generation. Vincent's back hit the wall, his expensive suit now soaked with sweat that reeked of terror. What do you want? Money? I can get you money. More than you've ever seen. The architect laughed. Money? Vincent, you misunderstand the nature of our transaction. This isn't a negotiation. This is an execution. Wait. Vincent's voice cracked. You can't just, there are laws. Due process. I have rights. Rights. The architect's head tilted at an angle that human necks couldn't achieve. Like the rights David Martinez had when the chemical plant poisoned him? Like the rights Sarah Martinez had when Judge Morrison buried her case? Like the rights Sophia Martinez has while you plan to sell her to the highest bidder. Vincent's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Every crime he'd committed, every corner he'd cut, every life he'd destroyed, somehow this thing knew all of it. You want to discuss rights, Vincent? Let's examine yours. You have the right to remain silent, though you'll scream anyway. You have the right to an attorney, though none of them will represent you where you're going. You have the right to a fair trial, which you're receiving right now. The architect stepped closer, and Vincent moved backwards slowly step by step. The verdict is guilty on all counts. The sentence is death, to be carried out with prejudice and malice aforethought. Do you have any last words, Vincent? Any final appeals to a mercy you never showed? Vincent's bladder released, sending warm urine streaming down his legs to pool in his Italian leather shoes. The lone shark who'd made children beg for their lives was reduced to his fundamental nature, a coward who preyed on the weak and folded when faced with real strength. Please, he whispered, the word barely audible. I'll do anything. Give you anything. Just don't, you have nothing I want and nothing I need, the architect replied. But you do have something I'm going to take. His hand shot out faster than lightning, his fingers wrapping around Vincent's throat with enough pressure to crack vertebrae. Vincent's feet left the floor as he was lifted into the air, his hands clawing uselessly at the architect's grip. Vincent Torino, the architect said formally, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. For crimes against humanity, for the corruption of justice, for the destruction of innocence, and for the sin of making children suffer for profit, I sentence you to death by biomass absorption. The feeding began slowly, almost gently. The architect's hand against Vincent's throat began to change, becoming porous, developing root-like tendrils that burrowed through skin and muscle to reach the rich network of blood vessels beneath. Vincent felt his life being drawn out of him like water through a straw, but that was only the beginning. The real violation came when the architect began absorbing Vincent's memories. Every moment of cruelty, every calculated act of evil, every time he'd smiled while destroying lives, all of it flowed into the architect's consciousness like sewage backing up into clean water. The psychic contamination was nauseating but necessary. Knowledge was power, and the architect needed to understand the full extent of Vincent's network. He saw Judge Morrison's private chambers, where cases were bought and sold like commodities at market. He saw Detective Ray Morrison taking envelopes of cash while evidence disappeared from lockup. He saw Captain Hayes providing police protection for drug shipments and human cargo. He saw Robert Cross, the plant manager, authorizing illegal chemical dumps while his lawyers prepared liability shields. He saw Maria Santos, the insurance investigator, shredding claims while bonus checks cleared her bank account. He saw a web of corruption that stretched across 3 states and involved dozens of officials, hundreds of victims, and millions of dollars in blood money. Each absorbed memory added another name to his list, another target for his particular brand of justice. Vincent's body withered as the feeding continued, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that was collapsing from the inside out. His face went from flushed to pale to gray, his eyes sinking back into their sockets as the architect consumed not just his life but his very essence. Your network, the architect said conversationally, quite extensive. Judge Morrison will be particularly interesting to meet. Vincent tried to speak, but his larynx had already been partially absorbed. The sound that emerged was more whistle than words, a pathetic keening that spoke of absolute despair. Don't worry, Vincent. Your death will have meaning. Every memory you've given me is another step toward balancing the scales. Your pain will purchase justice for your victims. Your life will pay for their suffering. The feeding process reached its climax as the architect absorbed the last of Vincent's viable biomass, leaving only a desiccated husk that barely resembled anything human. The corpse crumpled to the floor, its eyes now empty sockets staring at nothing. The architect stood in the center of the carnage, his form stabilizing as Vincent's absorbed mass integrated with his existing structure. He was stronger now, more knowledgeable, and infinitely more dangerous. The memories he'd consumed would guide his next targets, and the biomass he'd acquired would fuel his transformation into something even more lethal. From Sophia's bedroom came the soft sound of monitors beeping steadily. The little girl had slept through the entire execution, protected by medication and her mother's desperate prayers. Sarah Martinez remained pressed against her daughter's door, too terrified to look but too protective to run. The architect turned toward the bedroom, his footsteps silent on the blood-soaked carpet. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as shadows moved in the hallway, but when he spoke, his voice was gentle. Sarah Martinez, your daughter is safe. Your debt is forgiven. Vincent Torino will never hurt anyone again. She waited for a while, and when she finally gathered the courage to look, the apartment was empty, except for 4 corpses neatly arranged in a perfect square around her coffee table. At the center of the arrangement sat a small pair of scales, their balance arm broken but their meaning clear. On Sophia's nightstand, someone had left an envelope containing $50,000 in cash and a note written in elegant script, for medical expenses. The scales are broken, but justice endures. Outside, the architect melted back into Gotham's shadows, his hunt just beginning. Vincent's memories had given him new targets, each one guilty of crimes that demanded the harshest possible justice. The scales of justice were broken, but the architect would balance them with blood and bone until every debt was paid in full. In the distance, sirens wailed as someone reported violent noise in the Martinez building. But by the time the police arrived, they would find only 4 corpses and a mystery that would consume the front pages for weeks. The reign of Vincent Torino was over. The age of the architect had begun. Chapter 7, Memory Feast. Detective Ray Morrison sat in his unmarked car outside Torino's Italian restaurant, chain-smoking Marlboros and wondering why his meal ticket hadn't answered his phone in 6 hours. Vincent was religious about communication, part of what made him such a reliable source of supplemental income for a cop whose gambling debts exceeded his annual salary by a factor of 3. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from his bookie. Payment overdue. Interest compounding. 48 hours or we visit the wife. Ray crushed his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray and dialed Vincent's number again. Straight to voicemail, same as the last dozen times. Something was wrong. Vincent never went dark, especially not when Ray was carrying this much debt. The detective checked his service weapon, a Glock 19 that had disappeared 3 bullets over the past year, each one used to destroy evidence that might have inconvenienced Vincent's operations. Ray had told himself he was protecting the innocent by keeping drug dealers and human traffickers out of prison, where they'd just be replaced by someone worse. It was easier than admitting he'd sold his badge for 30 pieces of silver and a chance to break even at the track. Ray's radio crackled, all units, we have a 10 to 54 at Street, apartment 3B. Multiple fatalities, requesting detectives. That address made Ray's blood run cold. That was the building where Vincent went for his latest collection. If Vincent was dead. Ray keyed his radio. Detective Morrison responding. ETA 5 minutes. He drove through Gotham's Lower East Side with his emergency lights flashing, his mind racing through damage control scenarios. If Vincent was really dead, Ray needed to secure the loan shark's files before Internal Affairs started asking questions about their relationship. 23 months until retirement, and Ray wasn't about to let a dead criminal ruin his pension. The building was surrounded by patrol cars, their red and blue lights painting the brick walls in alternating colors of emergency. Ray badged his way past the perimeter, noting the unusual silence among the uniformed officers. Cops dealt with murder scenes regularly, but something about this one had them spooked. Officer Jenny Blake met him at the building entrance, her usually professional demeanor cracked around the edges. Detective Morrison? You're gonna want to see this, but it's not like anything in the manual. Ray climbed 3 flights of stairs, each step taking him closer to a scene that would haunt him for the remaining 23 months of his career. The door to apartment 3B hung off its hinges, splintered wood scattered across the hallway. Inside, the apartment looked like a slaughterhouse. Four bodies were arranged in a perfect square around the coffee table, each corpse positioned with symmetry. Vincent Torino's remains were barely recognizable, a desiccated husk that looked like it had been mummified while still alive. Tony Ricci lay in a pool of blood, his chest cut open. Bobby Torino appeared to have been crushed by some impossible force, his body compressed into a shape that violated several laws of physics. Marcus Webb's head was twisted completely around, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling while his body faced the floor. At the center of the arrangement sat a pair of broken scales, their balance arms snapped in half and their weighing pans scattered across the blood-soaked carpet. "Jesus Christ," Ray whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. "What the hell happened here?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Officer Blake replied. The door was burst open from outside. There are no shell casings, no bullet holes, no conventional weapons anywhere. It's like... She paused, searching for words. Like something just ate them without giving them time to react. Ray forced himself to approach Vincent's corpse, his stomach churning at the sight. The loan shark's face was frozen in an expression of terror, his mouth opened in a silent scream. But what disturbed Ray most was the absence of blood. Whatever had killed Vincent had drained him completely, leaving only empty skin and bones. "Where's the family?" Ray asked. "The Martinez woman and her kid?" "Gone," Blake replied. "Neighbors say they saw them leave around dawn, but nobody knows where they went. There's medical equipment in the bedroom. Looks like the kid was seriously ill." Ray walked through the apartment, his trained eye noticing details while his corrupt heart calculated risks. If Vincent's files were found on his body, Ray's name would be all over them. Bank deposits, payoff schedules, evidence destruction orders, enough to send him to prison for the rest of his natural life. But first, he needed to understand what had done this to Vincent. The loan shark had been a predator, surrounded by armed men and protected by corrupt officials. What kind of force could penetrate his security and execute his entire crew without any resistance? Ray's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Detective Raymond Morrison. Badge number 4471. Evidence locker access codes. Judge Morrison's nephew. $50,000 in gambling debts. Meeting at Warehouse District. Midnight. Come alone. The message was from his own phone number. Ray stared at the impossible text, his hands shaking as he read the words that seemed to know his deepest secrets. Someone had accessed his phone, his financial records, his family connections. Someone who knew exactly how much leverage they had over him. A sound from the bedroom made him look up, the soft beeping of medical equipment, even though the apartment was supposed to be empty. Ray drew his weapon and moved toward the sound, his training overriding his fear. The bedroom door was ajar, revealing a hospital bed with 4 equipment still running. But instead of a sick child, the bed contained a single black envelope sealed with dark red wax. Ray's name was written across the front in elegant script. Inside the envelope was a photograph of the warehouse, taken from an impossible angle that suggested the photographer had been floating 30 feet above the building. Written on the back in the same elegant script, "Your turn, detective. The scales demand balance." Ray pocketed the photograph and envelope, his mind racing through escape scenarios. He could run, take his pension and disappear into witness protection before whoever killed Vincent came for him. But running meant abandoning his wife, his kids, his entire life in Gotham. And something told him that whoever had sent the photograph wouldn't be deterred by distance or federal protection. "Detective Morrison?" Officer Blake's voice carried a note of urgency. "We found something else." Ray returned to the living room, where Blake was pointing at the coffee table. Carved into the wooden surface were the words, "When justice fails, judgment comes. R. Morrison, 23 hours remaining." Ray's service weapon felt suddenly heavy in his hands. 23 hours until what? Until he joined Vincent's corpse arrangement? Until his own secrets were exposed? Until whatever had killed the loan shark decided to balance the scales with his blood. His radio crackled again. "Detective Morrison, please respond to headquarters. Captain Hayes wants to see you immediately." Captain Hayes, another name on Vincent's payroll, another corrupt official who'd sold his integrity for a piece of the action. If Hayes was calling an emergency meeting, it meant word of Vincent's death was spreading through the criminal network like wildfire. Every dirty cop, Every bought judge, every corrupt official was about to discover that their protection was gone and their secrets were exposed. Ray holstered his weapon and headed for the door, his mind already working through contingency plans. He had 23 hours to figure out who had killed Vincent and why they'd targeted him next. 23 hours to decide whether to run, fight, or confess his sins and hope for mercy that probably didn't exist. Behind him, the broken scales caught the light from the overhead fixture, their shattered balance arm pointing toward the ceiling like an accusation made physical. The apartment fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens and the soft whisper of wine through the broken door. In the shadows between the buildings, something watched Detective Morrison leave. The architect had been patient, studying his next target through Vincent's absorbed memories. He knew about the gambling debts, the evidence destruction, the willful blindness that had allowed innocent people to suffer while criminals prospered. Ray Morrison had 23 hours to make peace with his crimes. The architect would spend those hours deciding whether the detective deserved a quick death or something more educational. The scales of justice were broken, but the architect was learning to build new ones from the bones of the guilty. Chapter 8: The Architect's Work. At midnight, the warehouse district was all shadows and rusted steel, the abandoned factories standing like tombstones for Gotham's dead industrial age. Detective Ray Morrison parked his car behind a loading dock, his service weapon loaded and an extra magazine tucked into his jacket pocket. He'd spent the last 23 hours researching every case connected to Vincent Torino, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might explain who had turned the lone shark into a mummified corpse. What he'd found instead was a network of corruption so vast and interconnected that it read like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Judges who dismissed cases for cash. Police who destroyed evidence for favors. City officials who approved permits for businesses that existed only on paper. Vincent hadn't been just a lone shark, he'd been the keystone holding together an entire architecture of institutional rot. And now the keystone was gone, leaving the whole structure ready to collapse. Ray's phone buzzed with the same impossible text: Warehouse 67. 3rd floor. Come alone. Time to balance the books. Warehouse 67 was a crumbling hulk, its windows smashed and walls covered in graffiti. Ray went in through a side door hanging open like a mouth, his footsteps echoing as he climbed a rusted staircase toward whatever awaited him. The 3rd floor was a maze of empty offices and abandoned machines, lit only by moonlight. Ray moved through the shadows with his weapon drawn, every instinct screaming that he was walking into a trap. But the alternative, spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, was worse than whatever waited in the darkness. Detective Morrison. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying sounds that normal vocal cords couldn't produce. You're punctual. I appreciate that in a business partner. Ray spun toward the sound, his Glock tracking through empty air. Show yourself. Gladly. The architect dropped from the ceiling like a spider descending its web, his form shifting and flowing in ways that hurt to watch. In the moonlight, Ray could see broad shoulders tapering to an impossibly narrow waist, arms that seemed to stretch and contract at will, and hands that looked more like surgical instruments than human appendages. Jesus Christ, Ray whispered, his training deserting him in the face of something that belonged in nightmares. Close, the architect replied, tilting his head at an angle that vertebrae shouldn't allow. But I'm more Old Testament than New. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life. Simple mathematics. Ray's finger tightened on his trigger, but something told him that bullets would be about as effective as words against whatever stood before him. What do you want? Justice, detective. The kind that your courts have forgotten how to deliver. The architect stepped closer, moving with grace. Vincent Torino told me so much about you before he died. Your gambling debts. Your evidence destruction. Your willful blindness to crimes that demanded investigation. I don't know what you're talking about. The architect laughed. Detective Raymond Morrison, badge number 4471. Gambling debts totaling $73,000 to 3 different bookmakers. Evidence destroyed, 47 drug samples, 23 weapons, 12 hard drives containing child pornography. Cases dismissed due to insufficient evidence, 89 felonies, 156 misdemeanors. Bribes received, $127,000 over the past 4 years. Ray's weapon shook as his darkest secret spilled from the creature's lips like water from a broken dam. How do you? Vincent was very thorough in his record keeping. He liked having leverage over his business partners. The architect's form solidified slightly, becoming more recognizably humanoid but no less terrifying. He kept detailed files on every corrupt official in his network. Bank records, photographs, audio recordings. Insurance policies, he called them. Ray's mouth went dry as sand. If Vincent had files on him, then whoever had killed the loan shark now possessed enough evidence to destroy his career, even his marriage and his whole life. What do you want? I want you to understand the mathematics of justice, detective. For every crime you've ignored, someone has suffered. For every piece of evidence you've destroyed, a victim has been denied closure. For every case you've helped dismiss, a predator has remained free to hunt. The architect began to circle Ray like a shark scenting blood, his movements terrifying. David Martinez died because you helped Vincent's chemical plant avoid EPA investigation. Sarah Martinez lost her home because you destroyed evidence of predatory lending practices. Sofia Martinez nearly died because her mother couldn't afford medical care after your corruption enabled Vincent's collection methods. I never killed anyone, Ray protested, his voice breaking. I just looked the other way. Ah, the Nuremberg defense. The architect stopped circling, facing Ray directly. You were just following orders. Just doing your job. Just trying to survive in a corrupt system. How refreshingly predictable. Ray raised his weapon, pointing it at center mass even though he doubted it would make any difference. Stay back. Or what, detective? You'll shoot me? Add attempted murder to your list of crimes. The architect's form began to shift again, becoming larger, more imposing. By all means, pull the trigger. Let's see if your aim is better than your moral compass. Ray's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the architect moved. The creature's speed was inhuman, not fast enough to blur, but quick enough to seem inevitable. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next his hand was wrapped around Ray's throat, lifting the detective off the ground. Detective Raymond Morrison, the architect said formally, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. For corruption of office, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder through willful negligence, I sentence you to death by biomass absorption. The feeding began immediately, the architect's hand becoming porous as it pressed against Ray's throat. The detective felt his life being drawn out of him like water through a straw, but that was only the beginning. The real violation came when the creature began absorbing his memories. 27 years of police work flooded into the architect's consciousness like a toxic river. Every bribe taken, every case buried, every victim ignored, all of it became part of the creature's expanding knowledge base. Ray's memories revealed a network of corruption that stretched from street-level dealers to federal judges, a web of influence that had protected Vincent's operations for nearly a decade. But more than that, Ray's memories revealed the human cost of institutional corruption. The architect saw through the detective's eyes as families were destroyed by crimes that went unpunished. He felt the weight of evidence that was never processed, testimony that was never heard, justice that was never served. Your partner, Detective Williams, the architect said conversationally as Ray's life force continued to drain away. Clean cop. He tried to investigate Vincent's operations 3 years ago. You had him transferred to the traffic division. He committed suicide 6 months later. Ray tried to speak but couldn't. Your wife knows about the gambling, the architect continued. She's been planning to leave you for 8 months. Your children haven't spoken to you voluntarily in over a year. Your corruption didn't just destroy your victims, detective, it destroyed your family. The feeding process reached its climax as the architect absorbed the last of Ray's viable biomass, leaving only a husk that barely resembled anything human. The corpse crumpled to the warehouse floor and its badge fell from its uniform to clatter on the concrete. The architect stood over the remains, his form stabilizing as Ray's absorbed mass integrated with his existing structure. The detective's memories had added dozens of new names to his list: corrupt judges, dirty cops, bought prosecutors, all of them complicit in the machinery of injustice that had protected Vincent's operations. But Ray's memories had also revealed something unexpected: Judge Morrison's personal schedule. Vincent's primary judicial protector would be alone in his chambers tomorrow night, reviewing cases and preparing bribes. It would be the perfect opportunity to balance another set of scales. The architect picked up Ray's badge and service weapon, studying them in the moonlight. Both were tools of justice corrupted by greed and cowardice, symbols of authority perverted into instruments of oppression. He pocketed the badge and crushed the gun in his enhanced grip, letting the twisted metal fall beside Ray's corpse like a broken promise. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching Gotham's skyline with fingers of gold and red. The city was waking up to discover that another pillar of Vincent's network had fallen. Another corrupt official had been removed from the equation. By the time the sun was fully risen, the architect would be studying his next target, preparing another lesson in the subject of justice. Judge Harold Morrison had limited time to live. The architect would spend them learning everything about the jurist's crimes, his family, and his weaknesses. Knowledge was power, and power was justice when wielded by the right hands. The scales of justice were broken, but the architect was building new ones from the bones of the guilty. Soon, they would balance perfectly. Chapter 9. Judgment Night. Judge Harold Morrison sat in his private chambers, reviewing the next day's docket while counting bribe money. 18 cases scheduled, 12 of them already decided by the thickness of envelopes slipped under his door. Justice was indeed blind, but she could still feel the weight of cash in her scales. Harold had been accepting payments for judicial decisions for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to make rulings based on law rather than remuneration. 23 years on the bench, and he'd probably sent more innocent people to prison than most serial killers. But the guilty ones who could afford his services walked free, returning to the streets to commit the crimes that kept his retirement fund growing. The news of Detective Morrison's death had reached him 6 hours ago, delivered by Captain Hayes in a phone call full of barely controlled panic. Vincent Torino dead. Detective Morrison missing, presumed dead. The entire network that had protected their operations for years was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. But Harold wasn't panicking. He was a federal judge, appointed for life and protected by marshals, congressional privilege, and 2 decades of carefully cultivated political connections. Whatever had killed Vincent and Ray Morrison would find him a more challenging target. Harold's private chambers were in the federal courthouse, a fortress of marble and steel that housed the machinery of American justice. The building was secured by federal marshals, metal detectors, and enough surveillance equipment to monitor a small city. Harold felt safe here, surrounded by the symbols of legal authority that had made him rich beyond his wildest dreams. His computer chimed with a new email from an address he didn't recognize, finalcourt@justice.gov. Harold frowned and opened the message, expecting another piece of spam or a routine administrative notice. Instead, he found a single line of text that made his blood run cold. The Honorable Harold Morrison. Docket number 666. The People vs. Harold Morrison. Charges: corruption of office, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder. Verdict: guilty. Sentence: death. Court is now in session. Harold stared at the impossible email address. Justice.gov was a secure government domain, accessible only to Department of Justice personnel with proper clearance. Someone had either hacked the federal email system or... Harold didn't want to consider the alternatives. His desk phone rang, the caller ID showing his own chamber number. Judge Morrison's chambers, Harold answered, his voice carefully controlled. Your Honor. The voice didn't sound like anything he had ever heard. This is the final court calling to inform you that your appeal has been denied. Execution will proceed as scheduled. Harold's hand tightened on the phone receiver. Who is this? How did you get this number? I am the architect of justice, Your Honor. I've been reviewing your case files. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The line went dead, leaving Harold alone with the sound of his own hammering heartbeat. He immediately called federal security, but the phone lines were down. His computer had locked itself, displaying only a single image, a pair of broken scales with his name carved into the balance arm. Harold opened his desk drawer and retrieved the .38 revolver he'd carried since his days as a prosecutor. The weapon felt reassuringly solid in his hands, a reminder that he'd survived 3 decades in the legal profession by being prepared for any eventuality. Whatever had killed Vincent and Ray would find him armed and ready. The lights in his chambers flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Emergency lighting should have activated immediately, but the room remained dark as a tomb. Harold could hear his own breathing, loud and ragged in the sudden silence. Bailiff. Harold shouted toward the door. Marshal Williams. I need security in here immediately. No response. The federal courthouse, usually bustling with activity even in the evening hours, had gone completely silent. Harold felt his way toward the door, his revolver extended in front of him like a shield against the darkness. The door was locked from the outside, impossible, since his chambers locked only from the inside. Harold fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to find the right one by touch. Behind him, something moved in the darkness. Judge Morrison. The voice came from inside his chambers, though Harold was certain he'd been alone moments before. Please return to your bench. Court is in session. Harold spun toward the sound, his revolver tracking through empty darkness. Show yourself. As you wish, Your Honor. The emergency lighting suddenly activated, bathing the chambers in harsh red illumination. Harold found himself face to face with something that belonged only in nightmares rather than his courtroom. The architect stood behind Harold's own bench, wearing the black robes of judicial office but filling them with an inhuman frame that suggested vast strength barely contained by fabric. What are you? Harold whispered, his revolver wavering in his grip. I am justice personified, Your Honor. The natural consequence of a system that has forgotten its purpose. The architect's head tilted at an impossible angle, studying Harold with interest. You've spent 23 years corrupting the law. Tonight, the law returns the favor. Harold raised his weapon and fired 3 shots center mass, the reports echoing in the confined space like thunder. The bullet struck the architect's chest and simply vanished, absorbed into the creature's biomass without leaving so much as a wrinkle in the judicial robes. Attempted murder of a court officer, the architect observed conversationally. That's a federal crime, Your Honor. Shall we add it to your list of charges? The creature began to move around the bench, his form shifting slightly as Vincent's and Ray's absorbed biomass integrated with his existing structure. In the red emergency lighting, he looked like a demon wearing the costume of justice, all teeth and shadows and hunger. 23 years, the architect continued, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated evidence. Vincent Torino paid you $50,000 to dismiss Sarah Martinez's wrongful death lawsuit. Detective Morrison paid you $25,000 to suppress evidence in the chemical plant investigation. Captain Hayes paid you $75,000 to throw the trafficking cases. Harold backed against the door, his empty revolver clicking uselessly as he pulled the trigger. That's not. I never. Judge Morrison, the architect said formally, producing a file folder from within his robes. Case number 97 to 4455. The People vs. Marcus Torino. Aggravated assault of a minor. Dismissed on a technicality after Vincent Torino paid you $100,000. Harold's face went white as the creature recited details that should have been buried in sealed records. How do you know that? Vincent kept excellent records. Insurance policies, he called them. Photographs of money changing hands. Audio recordings of your negotiations. Video surveillance of your meetings. The architect opened the file folder, revealing crime scene photographs that made Harold's stomach turn. This is what Marcus Torino did to that child after you set him free. 7 years old, Your Honor. She'll never fully recover from what he did to her. Harold's legs gave out, sending him sliding down the door to sit on the floor of his own chambers. 23 years of corrupted verdicts were catching up to him all at once, and the weight of accumulated guilt was crushing. The Hendricks case, the architect continued, producing another file. Vehicular homicide. The defendant was drunk, high on cocaine, and driving on a suspended license when he killed a family of 4. You dismissed the charges after his father paid you $200,000. More photographs, more evidence, more faces of the dead and destroyed. Harold had signed their death warrants with his gavel, trading their lives for money he'd spent on vacation homes and luxury cars. The Patterson case. The Williams case. The Chen case. The architect's voice was patient as a teacher explaining mathematics to a slow student. 87 dismissed charges. 143 reduced sentences. 219 corrupted verdicts. Each one paid for with blood money. The creature's form began to shift again, becoming larger, more imposing. Harold could see that the judicial robes were Vincent's skin, transformed and shaped into a mockery of legal authority. The architect wasn't just wearing the costume of justice, he was becoming justice itself, feeding on the guilty and growing stronger with each absorbed life. "Please," Harold whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "I'll confess. I'll resign. I'll make restitution." "Your Honor," the architect replied, stepping closer, "the time for plea bargaining has passed. The jury has reached its verdict." Harold looked around his chambers wildly, searching for the jury the creature mentioned. He saw only shadows and red light, but somehow he could feel their presence, all the victims of his corrupted justice, watching from the darkness as judgment finally came for their judge. "The verdict is guilty on all counts," the architect continued, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "The court sentences you to death by judicial execution, to be carried out immediately." The creature's hands transformed into something that belonged in medieval torture chambers rather than modern courtrooms. Harold screamed as the architect reached for him, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness that rushed up to claim him. The feeding was slow and deliberate, educational in its thoroughness. The architect absorbed not just Harold's life and memories, but his accumulated guilt, his suppressed conscience, his knowledge of every crime he'd helped commit. Each absorbed moment added to the creature's understanding of the corruption that had infected every level of the justice system. Harold's memories revealed the scope of the conspiracy: judges throughout the federal system, all of them connected by networks of bribery and mutual blackmail. The architect saw courtrooms where justice was auctioned to the highest bidder, prisons filled with the innocent while the guilty walked free, and a legal system so corrupted that it had become indistinguishable from organized crime. When the feeding was complete, Harold's desiccated corpse sat slumped in his own judicial chair, his gavel still clutched in one skeletal hand. The architect arranged the scene like an artist, positioning the body so that empty eye sockets stared directly at the scales of justice mounted on the chamber wall. On Harold's desk, the creature left a single piece of evidence, a recording device containing audio of every bribe the judge had ever accepted. The recordings would be found by federal marshals in the morning, along with Harold's corpse and a note written in elegant script: "Justice delayed is justice denied. The scales are now balanced." The architect departed through the courthouse's ventilation system, his enhanced physiology allowing him to flow through spaces that would be impossible for normal humans. Behind him, emergency systems began to reactivate as his presence withdrew, but it would be hours before anyone discovered the scene in Judge Morrison's chambers. By then, the architect would be studying his next target, preparing for another lesson in the subject of justice. The network that had protected Vincent Torino was falling apart, one corrupted official at a time. Soon, the scales would balance perfectly, and the innocent would finally have their day in court. The broken scales of justice were being rebuilt from the bones of the guilty, and the architect was just getting started. Chapter 10: Broken Scales. Commissioner James Gordon stood in the center of Judge Morrison's chambers, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh glare of crime scene lights. 37 years in law enforcement had shown him every conceivable form of human cruelty, but the tableau before him challenged his understanding of what was possible within the boundaries of the natural world. The judge's mummified corpse sat upright in his leather chair, skeletal fingers still gripping a gavel that would never again bang for order. Empty eye sockets stared at the scales of justice mounted on the chamber wall, scales that someone had carefully broken, their balance arms snapped in half and left dangling like a severed limb. "Third one this week," Detective Harvey Bullock muttered, lighting his 8th cigarette of the morning despite the no-smoking signs plastered throughout the federal courthouse. Same MO, same impossible crime scene. Same calling card. Gordon nodded grimly, his attention focused on the arrangement of evidence scattered across Morrison's desk. Bank statements showing deposits that far exceeded a federal judge's salary. Audio recordings of conversations that would destroy a dozen political careers. Photographs of money changing hands in locations that federal marshals were already moving to secure. Any connection between the victims? Gordon asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Vincent Torino, Detective Ray Morrison, and now Judge Harold Morrison, Bullock recited, consulting his notepad. All three connected to cases involving dismissed charges, destroyed evidence, and suspiciously lenient sentences. Someone's cleaning house. Jim. Someone with a very specific idea of justice. Gordon walked to the chamber's tall windows, looking out over Gotham's federal district. The city spread out before him, its corruption exposed and chilling. "The media's calling him the architect," Gordon said quietly. "Anonymous tips to every major news outlet, complete with evidence packages that internal affairs can't ignore. 3 corrupt officials dead, and enough documentation to bring down half the city's power structure." Bullock joined him at the window. His perpetually rumpled appearance was made worse by 3 days of overtime investigating impossible murders. You think this is connected to the other cases? The missing persons reports from the chemical plant? The sudden resignations in the DA's office? I think we're looking at something that doesn't play by the rules we're used to, Gordon replied. Whoever this is, they have access to information that should be impossible to obtain. Bank records, private conversations, sealed court documents. Either we're dealing with someone inside the system, or what? Gordon was saved from answering by the arrival of Federal Marshal Susan Williams, her usually pristine uniform wrinkled from a sleepless night coordinating security protocols. Commissioner Gordon, we've got a problem. Bigger than a serial killer targeting federal officials? The audio recordings we found on Morrison's desk, Williams continued, her voice tight with stress. Forensics says they're authentic. 23 years of recorded conversations between Morrison and various criminal enterprises. If even half of these cases need to be re-examined. How many? Gordon asked, though he dreaded the answer. Preliminary count? Over 300 felony cases that might need to be overturned. Dozens of criminals who should be in prison but are walking free. Hundreds of victims who were denied justice because Morrison took bribes to dismiss their cases. Gordon felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of a system so corrupted that even its guardians couldn't be trusted. What about the other recordings? The ones implicating Detective Morrison and Captain Hayes. Hayes disappeared 6 hours ago, Williams replied. Left his badge and service weapon on his desk, along with a resignation letter and a full confession. Internal Affairs is having a field day. Before Gordon could respond, his radio crackled with a priority dispatch. All units, we have a possible homicide at the docks. Warehouse District, Pier 50. Requesting detectives and the medical examiner. Gordon and Bullock exchanged glances. Pier 50 was Hayes' territory. The corrupt captain had been taking bribes to allow drug shipments through that particular dock for the better part of a decade. Let's go, Gordon said, already heading for the door. Something tells me we're about to find our missing captain. Pier 50, the dock's Captain Michael Hayes hung from a shipping crane, 40 feet above the dock, his body grotesquely suspended by chains that threaded throughout his frame. Commissioner Gordon stood beneath the suspended corpse, his neck craned back at an angle that was already giving him a headache. The crime scene was a study in impossible logistics, no ladder tall enough to reach the crane's arm, no heavy equipment capable of lifting a body to that height, and no explanation for how someone had managed to thread chains through Hayes' bones without completely dismantling the skeleton. Coroner's preliminary assessment. Detective Bullock called from beside the evidence van. Cause of death appears to be complete exsanguination, same as the others. But get this, the chains aren't holding the body up. They're threaded through the bones, but the skeleton is somehow maintaining structural integrity without soft tissue. Gordon rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. Any security cameras? 3 different angles, all showing the same impossible footage. Hayes enters the warehouse at 11:47 p.m. At 12:23 a.m., something that looks like a shadow pours out of the building and flows up the crane. At 12:51 a.m., the body appears suspended from the crane arm. Nothing in between, no explanation for how it got there. Witnesses. Dock workers found him at 6 a.m. when they arrived for their shift. Nobody saw anything, nobody heard anything. The night security guard says he did his rounds every hour and swears the crane was empty at midnight. Gordon's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Commissioner, we've got Batman at the perimeter. Says he wants to examine the scene. Let him through, Gordon replied, already knowing that normal police methods weren't going to solve crimes that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. The Dark Knight emerged from the shadows between shipping containers, his cape flowing behind him like spilled ink. Gordon had worked with Batman for over a decade, but the vigilante's presence still made him slightly uncomfortable, a reminder that even heroic justice sometimes operated outside legal boundaries. Commissioner, Batman said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone that made criminals confess their sins rather than face interrogation. I need to examine the body. 40 feet up a crane, Gordon replied. Unless you brought a ladder. Batman's answer was to fire his grappling hook at the crane's arm and rose smoothly, as if gravity was optional for him. Gordon watched through binoculars as the vigilante examined Hayes' remains, taking photographs and collecting samples with the methodical precision of a trained forensic investigator. 5 minutes later, Batman descended to the dock carrying evidence bags that Gordon suspected contained materials no conventional laboratory could analyze. "What did you find?" Gordon asked. "The chains are made from Hayes' own bones," Batman replied, his voice carrying a note of disgust that Gordon had rarely heard from a usually unshakable vigilante. "Someone broke down his skeletal structure and reformed it into restraints, then used those restraints to suspend what was left of his body." Gordon felt his stomach turn as the implication sank in. That's not medically possible. Neither was draining Vincent Torino's blood without leaving a single puncture wound, or mummifying Detective Morrison without removing any organs. We're dealing with someone who can manipulate biological matter in ways that shouldn't exist. Before Gordon could respond, his radio erupted with emergency chatter. "All units, we have multiple homicides at City Hall. Repeat, multiple homicides at City Hall. Requesting all available detectives and the medical examiner." Batman was already moving toward his vehicle when Gordon grabbed his arm. "Wait. If you're right about this killer's capabilities, City Hall could be a trap. Whoever this is, they're escalating. 3 isolated murders, now a mass casualty event at the center of city government." "Which is why I need to get there first," Batman replied, pulling free from Gordon's grip. "This killer is targeting corruption, Commissioner. How many officials in City Hall have clean hands?" Gordon's silence was answer enough. Batman disappeared into the shadows, leaving the Commissioner alone with Hayes' suspended corpse and the growing certainty that Gotham was about to discover just how deep its corruption ran. High above the docks, something moved in the shadows between the crane's support beams. The architect had been watching the crime scene, studying the police response and noting the faces of officials who showed surprise rather than guilt when confronted with evidence of corruption. Commissioner Gordon was clean, his shock at Hayes' crimes was genuine, and his dedication to justice authentic. Detective Bullock was cynical but honest, his disgust at police corruption real rather than performed. But there were others in the crowd of officials and observers who showed guilt rather than surprise when Hayes' crimes were detailed. The architect added their names to his growing list, cross-referencing their faces with the memories he'd absorbed from Vincent, Ray, and Harold. The scales of justice were broken, but the architect was building new ones from the bones of the guilty. Soon, very soon, they would balance perfectly. City Hall, emergency session few minutes ago. Mayor Hamilton Hill sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by the remnants of his administration and trying to project confidence while his career crumbled around him like a house built on quicksand. The emergency session had been called after Hayes' body was discovered, but the agenda had expanded as more corruption came to light. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hill began, his political smile looking increasingly strained. "We need to address the recent incidents before the media turns this into a circus." District Attorney Janet Van Dorn shuffled through files that contained enough evidence to destroy a dozen careers, her usual composure cracked like ice over deep water. "Mr. Mayor, we're looking at corruption involving multiple departments. The evidence recovered from Judge Morrison's chambers alone is enough to overturn hundreds of convictions." "We need damage control," Hill replied, his voice carrying the desperation of a politician watching his legacy evaporate. "We need scapegoats. Someone to blame for the corruption while the rest of US can distance ourselves from the scandal." Assistant DA David Reeves looked up from his own stack of incriminating documents. "Sir, with respect, there may not be anyone left to distance. The corruption network that protected Torino's operations included officials at every level of city government." Hill's forced smile became more vile. "Then we need to make sure the investigation stays focused on the dead. Vincent Torino, Detective Morrison, Judge Morrison, and Captain Hayes, all conveniently deceased and unable to implicate anyone else." "What about the evidence?" Van Dorn asked. "There are bank records, audio recordings, and photographic documentation. Someone compiled a comprehensive dossier on our associations with criminal enterprises." "Evidence can be discredited," Hill replied, his political instincts finally asserting themselves. "Hearsay, doctored recordings, and fabricated documents planted by disgruntled criminals. We control the narrative, and the narrative is that a few bad apples corrupted the system without our knowledge." The lights in the conference room flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Hill glanced up at the lights with mild irritation, as if municipal electrical problems were just another item on his agenda of concerns. The Batman was at the Hayes crime scene, Police Chief O'Hara reported, consulting his notepad. Gordon's bringing him into the investigation as a consultant. Absolutely not, Hill snapped. The last thing we need is a vigilante running around with access to classified information. Batman operates outside legal oversight. He could be working with whoever's targeting our officials. Van Dorn's expression grew thoughtful. Actually, Mr. Mayor, that raises an interesting point. Batman has been fighting corruption in the city for years. What if he's escalated his methods? The room fell silent as the implication sank in. If Batman had decided to permanently eliminate corrupt officials rather than simply arresting them, every person at the table was potentially a target. That's impossible, Reeves protested. Batman doesn't kill. It's his one rule. Rules can change, Hill replied, his political mind already working through the possibilities. Especially if someone gets tired of seeing criminals walk free through corrupted courts. The lights flickered again, this time staying dark for nearly 10 seconds before the emergency lighting activated. In the red glow of the emergency system, shadows seemed to move with purpose through the conference room. Ladies and gentlemen, an inhuman voice said from the darkness, the emergency session of the final court is now in order. Mayor Hill fumbled for the panic button beneath the conference table, but his fingers found only empty space where the device should have been. Around the table, city officials reached for phones that had mysteriously lost their signals, weapons that had somehow disappeared from their holsters, and panic alarms that no longer responded to desperate pressing. Don't bother, the voice continued as a shape began to solidify in the shadows at the far end of the room. This court operates under different rules than the ones you're used to corrupting. The architect stepped into the red emergency lighting like a nightmare given form and purpose. In the hellish illumination, his shifted form looked like a demon wearing a business suit. The Honorable Hamilton Hill, the creature began, consulting what appeared to be a court docket written in blood. Mayor of Gotham City. Net worth, $8 million on a salary of $120,000 annually. Interesting mathematics. Hill tried to stand but found his legs wouldn't support him. Around the table, his fellow officials sat frozen like deer in headlights, their corrupt hearts finally face to face with something that made their worst nightmares seem like children's bedtime stories. District Attorney Janet Van Dorn, the architect continued. 237 cases dismissed due to procedural errors. Average payment per dismissal, $50,000. Your dedication to due process is admirable. Assistant District Attorney David Reeves. 11 murder cases that never went to trial due to insufficient evidence. Interesting how evidence disappears when defense attorneys pay enough to make it vanish. The creature moved around the table, his form shifting as absorbed biomass integrated with his existing structure. Each official he named showed guilt rather than surprise, confirmation that his intelligence was accurate and his targets were legitimate. Police Chief Samuel O'Hara. 43 years of service, 27 years of taking bribes. Drug shipments protected, evidence destroyed, witnesses intimidated. Your badge has more blood on it than Vincent Torino's hands. O'Hara tried to draw his service weapon, but the gun had somehow transformed into a pair of broken scales that crumbled to dust in his grip. The final court has reviewed your cases, the architect announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The verdict is unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentence is death, to be carried out with extreme prejudice. Mayor Hill found his voice at last, though it emerged as more squeaks than words. You can't do this. We have rights. This is murder. Van Dorn protested, her prosecutorial training finally asserting itself. Whatever crimes we may have committed, you don't have the authority to execute us. Authority. The architect's head tilted at an impossible angle. Madam District Attorney, I am the inevitable consequence of a justice system that has forgotten its purpose. When courts become auction houses and judges become salesmen, something must restore the balance. The feeding began with the architect's hands transforming into instruments of biological absorption that made medieval torture devices seem merciful by comparison. Each official was consumed in turn, their memories and biomass becoming part of the creature's expanding consciousness. Mayor Hill's memories revealed a network of corruption that stretched beyond Gotham to include state and federal officials. Van Dorn's absorbed knowledge showed how the legal system had been systematically perverted to protect wealthy criminals. Reeves's experiences detailed the precise methods used to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. By the time the feeding was complete, the conference room looked like a museum display of mummified remains, each corpse positioned around the table where they'd once planned to cover up their crimes. At the center of the arrangement, the architect left a single exhibit, a pair of scales balanced with documents detailing every bribe, every cover-up, every perversion of justice that the consumed officials had committed. The scales were no longer broken. They balanced perfectly. Outside City Hall, emergency vehicles were already converging on reports of screams and flickering lights. By the time they reached the conference room, they would find only dried-up corpses and enough evidence to prosecute a dozen more officials who hadn't been present for the emergency session. The architect departed through the building's ventilation system. Behind him, the emergency lighting finally stabilized, illuminating a scene that would dominate headlines for months and change Gotham's understanding of justice forever. The broken scales had been repaired, balanced with the blood and bones of the corrupt. But the architect's work was far from finished. Each absorbed mind had revealed new targets, new crimes, and new debts that demanded payment in full. Chapter 11. Psychology 101. Gotham Community College. The lecture hall buzzed with Monday morning energy, coffee cups rattling, notebooks flipping open, whispered conversations about weekend escapades. Alex Thorne sat in his usual spot, third row center, close enough to demonstrate engagement but far enough back to observe without drawing attention. Professor Martha walked to the podium with her characteristic brisk stride, graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been teaching abnormal psychology at Gotham University for over 2 decades, and her reputation for challenging students preceded her. Today we're discussing antisocial personality disorder, she announced, clicking to the first slide. The symptoms appeared in neat bullet points: lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, manipulative behavior, and absence of guilt or remorse. Around the room, students scribbled notes with varying degrees of interest. Jessica Chen highlighted everything in bright yellow. The football player in the back row was clearly still hungover from whatever fraternity party he'd attended. Can anyone give me an example of how someone with ASPD might present in everyday life? Professor Martha asked, scanning the room. Several hands went up. Psychology majors eager to impress, pre-med students building their transcripts. Alex kept his hands folded, taking careful notes in neat handwriting. They might seem charming at first, offered a blonde girl in the front row. Like, really charismatic, but it's all surface-level manipulation. Good. What else? They don't feel bad about hurting people, said another student. They know it's wrong intellectually, but they don't actually care. Professor Martha nodded. Exactly. The cognitive understanding of social rules without the emotional component that typically enforces them. These individuals often excel at reading others, becoming experts at identifying vulnerabilities. A hand shot up from the back corner. Marcus Kellerman, pre-law, political science double major, known for his passionate debates in every class he took. His dark eyes held an intensity that made other students uncomfortable. But Professor, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent room, wouldn't someone like that just be another kind of criminal? If they don't have normal moral constraints, they're basically predators waiting to happen. Professor Martha considered this. That's certainly one perspective, Marcus. Though many individuals with these traits never become violent. They might simply be more pragmatic. Right, but here's what I don't understand, Marcus continued, leaning forward in his seat. We have all these systems, police, courts, prisons, but they clearly don't work. Look at Gotham. Corruption everywhere, criminals getting off on technicalities, victims never getting real justice. Several students shifted uncomfortably. The Torino murders had dominated local news for weeks. Vincent Torino and his crew, found tortured to death in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of their crimes. The killer had left a calling card, broken scales fashioned from the victim's own bones. So maybe, Marcus said, his voice gaining heat, maybe someone who thinks differently isn't the problem. Maybe they're the solution. If someone had the ability to actually stop these predators, permanently, wouldn't that be objectively better than letting them manipulate our broken system? Uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Professor Martha's expression tightened, but Marcus wasn't finished. Look at Vincent Torino. How many families did he destroy? How many women did he have his men grape for insurance? The police knew. Everyone knew. But he had connections, he had money, he had lawyers. So he kept operating while children suffered. Marcus, Professor Martha tried to interrupt. No, let me finish, he said, standing now, pacing slightly. Whoever killed Torino didn't just eliminate a predator. They sent a message. They showed every other corrupt piece of filth in the city that money and connections won't save them. That someone is watching. Someone who actually cares about justice. The room was dead silent now. Several students looked genuinely frightened by Marcus's intensity. The person who did that, they're not a criminal. They're what justice looks like when the system completely fails. Alex raised his hand slowly. Professor Martha nodded at him, relief visible on her face. I have to respectfully disagree with Marcus, Alex said, his voice calm and measured. That kind of thinking is exactly how we get vigilante violence. It's how we get people taking the law into their own hands. Marcus turned to stare at him, clearly surprised by the pushback. But Alex, you have to admit the system is broken. How many times do we see criminals walk free while their victims suffer? The system being imperfect doesn't justify abandoning it, Alex replied steadily. When individuals decide their judge, jury, and executioner, where does it end? Who decides who deserves to die? What prevents that person from becoming the very monster they claim to be fighting? At least they're doing something instead of letting evil flourish unchecked, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. Alex shook his head. But that's exactly the problem. Once you cross that line, once you decide some people don't deserve due process, you've lost your humanity. You've become the same kind of person you're supposedly fighting. So children should suffer because we're worried about the moral purity of their potential saviors? Marcus's hands clenched into fists. You'd rather preserve some abstract principle than save actual lives? I'd rather work within the system to fix it, Alex said firmly. Support police reform, vote for better prosecutors, donate to victim advocacy groups. Real change comes through institutions, not through one person's twisted idea of justice. Jessica nodded along beside him. Alex is right. Vigilantes are just criminals who think they're heroes. Same mentality, thinking rules don't apply to them. Exactly, Alex continued. The moment we decide that ends justify means, we lose any moral authority to judge anyone else. A society of laws might be imperfect, but it's preferable to a society where individuals dispense personal vengeance. Marcus looked genuinely angry now. So we just accept that evil people will keep destroying innocents while we file paperwork and hope politicians grow consciences? We work for change, Alex replied without hesitation. Real, systemic change. Not the temporary satisfaction of murdering individual criminals. What about true psychopaths? Asked a quiet voice from the corner. What if someone genuinely lacks empathy? What if they see other people as just objects to be used? Alex turned to consider the question seriously. Then they need treatment. Rehabilitation, medication, therapy. If that fails, secure containment. But the moment we start deciding some people are irredeemable, we open the door to horrific abuses. Even if they've committed atrocities, the girl pressed. Especially then, Alex said firmly. Because if we only protect the rights of people we like, then they aren't really rights at all. Marcus was staring at Alex with something approaching disgust. You're exactly what's wrong with this world. All theory, no action. You'd rather let monsters destroy families than get your hands dirty. And you're exactly the kind of person who becomes a monster while believing they're a hero, Alex replied calmly. Professor Martha quickly stepped in. That's enough for today. This is exactly why we study these disorders, to understand intervention and treatment, not to rationalize violence. As students began packing up, Marcus stormed past Alex's desk without a word. Several classmates approached Alex instead. That was really well said, Jessica offered. It's scary how Marcus thinks, you know? With everything happening in the city. People want simple solutions to complex problems, Alex replied. But the easy path usually leads somewhere dark. Yeah. Like whoever killed those loan sharks. People online are calling him a hero, but it's still murder. Alex nodded gravely. Absolutely. No matter how terrible the victims were, crossing that line changes everything. Professor Martha watched approvingly as Alex discussed ethics with his classmates. Here was a student who understood the importance of institutional justice, who could argue passionately for human rights even when discussing society's worst criminals. After the room emptied, Alex gathered his material slowly. Through the tall windows, autumn sunlight cast long shadows across the campus quad. Students hurried past in clusters, their conversations mixing into white noise. Walking back toward his dorm, Alex passed the campus news board. Headlines about the Torino murders still dominated the local section. Police remained baffled by the killer's methods and motivation. The FBI had been called in, but they seemed equally stumped. In his dorm room, Alex set his backpack on the desk and pulled out his psychology textbook. He had reading to catch up on before his next class. But first, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, pushing aside old assignments and unused notebooks. Hidden beneath everything else was a small wooden box, unremarkable except for the careful craftsmanship of its joints. Alex lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black velvet, lay a miniature sculpture no bigger than his palm. Scales of justice, carved from what appeared to be bone, but the left arm was snapped cleanly in half. The broken piece lay beside the main sculpture, never to be rejoined. Alex picked up the delicate carving, turning it slowly in the afternoon light. The bone had been bleached white, then polished to an almost luminous sheen. Tiny scratches marked the surface, deliberate imperfections that caught the light. He set the broken scales on his desk beside his psychology textbook, the irony not lost on him. Here lay the symbol of justice abandoned, while Marcus Kellerman raged about the failures of law and order, never suspecting that the very person he defended sat 3 rows away, quietly arguing for due process and human rights. The scales caught the sunlight, casting fragmented shadows across his notes about antisocial personality disorder. Alex stared at them for a long moment, then carefully returned the carving to its box. He had studying to do. And later tonight, he had research to conduct about a certain police captain in Star City whose son had been avoiding consequences for far too long. The mask was fitting more comfortably each day. Chapter 12. Batman's Hun. The Batcave's forensic lab hummed with quiet efficiency, monitors casting blue light across Bruce Wayne's focused features. Weeks had passed since the discovery of Vincent Torino's mutilated crew, and every piece of evidence only deepened the mystery. Computer, display Torino crime scene analysis, Bruce commanded, settling into the workstation chair. Holographic images materialized around him, the apartment where 4 men had died in ways that defied conventional criminal psychology. Each body had been positioned with surgical precision, arranged to form the shape of a square with a pair of broken scales at the center. The killer knew details that were never made public, Bruce murmured, manipulating the 3D crime scene reconstruction. Torino's method of using assault as leverage against debtors. The location of his offshore accounts. Even the names of victims who never came forward. He zoomed in on the bone fragments found at the scene, carved into the shape of broken scales, arranged where the balance point should have been. The craftsmanship was remarkable, requiring hours of careful work with tools that suggested either medical or artistic training. Alfred, Bruce called toward the cave's upper levels. The butler's voice crackled through the comm system. Yes, Master Bruce? What did the lab results show on those bone fragments? Quite fascinating, actually. The bones came from the victims themselves, specifically, Vincent Torino's radius and ulna. However, the carving work was done post-mortem, suggesting the killer took time to create his calling card after completing the executions. Bruce leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The methodical nature of the crime suggested someone with significant psychological training. The killer hadn't acted in passion or rage. This was calculated, symbolic, and designed to send a message to a specific audience. Computer, cross-reference similar mutilation patterns in the GCPD database. No matches found in Gotham City records, the system responded. Expanding search to national databases. While the search ran, Bruce pulled up the apartment's security footage from nearby cameras. The killer had been careful, too careful. Every angle had been anticipated, every blind spot exploited. The only glimpse showed a figure in dark clothing, moving with fluid precision that suggested military or martial arts training. Whoever this is, Bruce said to himself, they've studied law enforcement procedure extensively. The computer chimed. Search complete. No matching patterns found in the FBI database. However, 3 similar cases have occurred in the past 18 months. Portland, Oregon, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan. All involved organized crime figures found tortured to death with bone sculptures left at the scene. Bruce's eyes narrowed. A serial killer with a specific target profile, moving between cities, leaving no trace except for elaborate calling cards. But unlike most serial killers, this one seemed focused on criminals who'd escaped justice through corruption or technicalities. Display Portland case file. The hologram shifted to show another crime scene, a meth lab where 2 distributors had been found flayed alive, their bones carved into the shape of a noose. The local media had dubbed it the Hangman Murders, but police had no leads. Cleveland showed similar patterns, a human trafficking ring dismantled through extreme violence, with calling cards made from the perpetrator's own remains. Detroit featured a corrupt judge and his bagman, tortured for hours before being arranged in a mockery of courtroom seating. Alfred, what's the common thread between these cities? Each location experienced a high-profile case where organized crime figures avoided prosecution due to procedural errors or witness intimidation. The murders occurred between 6 and 18 months after these legal failures. Bruce stood, pacing in front of the massive computer display. Someone was systematically hunting criminals who'd escaped justice, using methods that suggested deep psychological insight into both the victims and the broader criminal justice system. Pull up enrollment records for criminal psychology programs in universities near each crime scene, Bruce instructed. Cross-reference with military service records, medical training, and anyone with access to both anatomical knowledge and behavioral analysis. The search would take hours, but Bruce had learned patience in his crusade against Gotham's criminal element. Meanwhile, he needed to examine the crime scene himself, something the GCPD's forensics team might have missed. 40 minutes later, Batman stood in the apartment where Vincent Torino had met his end. Police tape still fluttered from the rafters, but the building itself had been cleared for demolition. The concrete floor bore dark stains that industrial cleaners couldn't quite eliminate. Batman knelt where Torino's body had been positioned, running his gloved fingers across barely visible scratches in the concrete. The killer had carved something here, symbols too faint for police cameras to detect, but visible under the right light. He activated a UV scanner built into his cowl, watching as faint markings appeared across the floor. Not random scratches, deliberate symbols arranged in precise geometric patterns. Mathematical equations, chemical formulas, and psychological notation. Fascinating, Batman murmured, photographing each symbol with high-resolution cameras. Our killer is highly educated. Multiple advanced degrees, based on this notation. One symbol caught his attention, a stylized representation of dopamine and serotonin molecular structures, surrounded by what appeared to be behavioral conditioning formulas. Whoever had done this understood brain chemistry at minimum at the graduate level. Batman moved to where each crew member had died, finding similar markings beneath every position. The killer had essentially turned the crime scene into a psychological thesis, using the victim's blood as ink to illustrate theories about criminal behavior and appropriate consequences. Near the apartment's eastern wall, Batman discovered something the police had missed entirely, a ventilation grate that showed signs of recent disturbance. He pried it open, revealing a space that is connected to the ventilation system. Inside the tunnel, waterproof pouches contained detailed files on not just Torino's crew but dozens of other criminals operating throughout Gotham. Financial records, victim testimonies, and police reports that had been buried or dismissed. The killer had spent months researching every target, building comprehensive cases that would stand up in any legitimate court. This isn't random violence, Batman realized, studying the meticulous documentation. This is someone trying to be judge, jury, and executioner because they believe the system is fundamentally flawed. At the bottom of the largest file, Batman found something that made his blood run cold: detailed psychological profiles of Gotham's major crime families, with specific recommendations for corrective intervention. The Penguins organization, Two-Face gang, and even preliminary research on the Joker's psychological framework. Their killer wasn't just eliminating small-time criminals. They were working their way up to Gotham's most dangerous villains, and they had the skills to potentially succeed. Batman sealed the evidence carefully, his mind already racing through the implications. Someone with advanced psychological training, extensive criminal justice knowledge, and no moral constraints about murder was systematically hunting Gotham's criminal element. Under different circumstances, Bruce might have felt conflicted about stopping them. Many of their targets were indeed monsters who'd escaped justice through corruption or legal technicalities. But vigilante justice, even well-intended vigilante justice, represented a fundamental threat to the rule of law. As Batman emerged from the apartment, his comm system crackled with an incoming message from Oracle. "Batman, we've got another situation developing. Star City PD just found Captain Hayden and his son dead in Star City. Tortured, mutilated, arranged in some kind of symbolic display." Bruce's jaw tightened. Their killer was escalating, moving to new cities, new targets. And based on the timeline, they'd been in Star City while he'd been analyzing their previous work in Gotham. "Send me everything on the Star City scene," Batman commanded, firing his grappling gun toward the distant rooftops. "And put together a psychological profile team. We're hunting someone who understands criminal behavior better than most law enforcement professionals." As he swung through Gotham's night sky, Batman couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step behind. Their killer moved with purpose and precision, striking at targets across multiple cities while leaving virtually no trace of their true identity. But everyone made mistakes eventually. And when this killer finally slipped up, Batman would be ready. The question was, how many more would die before that happened? Chapter 13. Campus Shadows. Star City University. A few days ago. The campus library stayed open until midnight during finals week, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across study tables where exhausted students hunched over textbooks and laptops. Maria Santos preferred the quiet corners on the third floor, where she could spread out her sociology notes without distraction. At 21, Maria had worked twice as hard as most of her classmates to get here. First-generation college student, daughter of immigrants who cleaned office buildings to pay her tuition. Every grade mattered, every assignment was a step closer to the social work degree that would let her help families like her own. She glanced at her watch. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until the library closed, then the long walk across campus to her dorm. Maria had made this journey dozens of times without incident, but tonight something felt different. Wrong. She'd noticed him 3 hours ago. Tall, athletic build, expensive clothes that marked him as one of the wealthy students who treated SCU like their personal playground. He'd been sitting 2 tables away, but she'd caught him staring when she looked up from her textbook. Not the casual glance of someone daydreaming during study sessions. Something more focused. More predatory. When she'd moved to a different floor, he'd followed. When she'd switched study rooms, he'd appeared again 10 minutes later. Always maintaining distance, always with a book or laptop as cover, but Maria had grown up in neighborhoods where you learned to recognize when someone was hunting you. "Attention students," the librarian's voice echoed through the building's PA system. "The library will be closing in 10 minutes. Please gather your belongings and proceed to the exits." Maria packed quickly, shoving notes and textbooks into her backpack with trembling hands. Around her, other students began their own exodus, yawning, stretching, complaining about tomorrow's exams. Normal college students doing normal college things. She waited until a group of girls from her dorm headed toward the stairs, then fell into step behind them. Safety in numbers, her mother had always said. But as they reached the library's main exit, the group scattered toward different residence halls. Maria stood alone under the harsh security lights, looking across the quad toward Campus Hall. 200 yards of open space, then the safety of her locked room. She'd made this walk countless times, but tonight every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. She started walking, keys ready in her hand the way campus security had taught them during orientation. Walk with purpose, stay alert, and trust your instincts. Her sneakers made soft sounds against the concrete pathway, mixing with distant music from a fraternity party somewhere across campus. Halfway to her dorm, Maria heard footsteps behind her. Measured, deliberate, matching her pace. She sped up slightly. The footsteps sped up too. She slowed down. They slowed down as well. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to look. The same student from the library, now maybe 50 feet behind her. Close enough that she could see his face clearly under the security lights. Handsome in a cruel way, with dark hair and predatory eyes that reminded her of documentaries about serial killers. Maria broke into a jog, abandoning any pretense of casual behavior. Behind her, the footsteps quickened as well. No longer hiding, no longer pretending this was coincidence. Campus Hall loomed ahead, its entrance bright with security lighting. Maria ran now, backpack bouncing against her spine, keys cutting into her palm where she gripped them like weapons. 50 yards. 30. 20. A hand seized her shoulder, spinning her around with shocking strength. She found herself staring into Danny Hayden's face. She'd seen him around campus and heard other girls whisper warnings about staying away from him. Rich boy, police captain's son, someone who'd never faced consequences for anything in his privileged life. "Where are you going so fast, Maria?" Danny asked, his voice carrying the slight slur of expensive alcohol. "I've been trying to get your attention all night." "Let go of me," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. Students moved past them in the distance, but no one seemed to notice the interaction. Just another late-night campus encounter to outsiders. "Come on, don't be like that." Danny stepped closer, his grip tightening on her shoulder. "I just want to talk. Maybe buy you a drink, get to know you better." "I said let go." Maria tried to pull away, but Danny's grip was iron-strong. His other hand moved to her waist, fingers pressing against her hip in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know, I've been watching you for weeks," Danny continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "All those nights in the library, working so hard. I like that about you, the dedication, the focus. I bet you'd be very focused on other things too." Maria drove her knee upward, aiming for his groin, but Danny twisted aside with practiced ease. He laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the night air. "Feisty. I like that too." His hand moved higher on her torso. "My apartment's just off campus. Much more comfortable than trying to get to know each other out here." "Help!" Maria screamed, her voice echoing across the quad. "Somebody help me!" Danny's expression darkened. His hand clamped over her mouth, muffling her cries, while his other arm wrapped around her waist. He was stronger than he looked, lifting her off her feet despite her struggles. "None of that," he hissed in her ear. "You want to make this difficult? Fine. But you're going to come with me either way." He began dragging her toward the parking lot behind Campus Hall, where his BMW waited under broken security lights. Maria clawed at his hands, tried to bite his palm, and kicked at his legs. Nothing worked. Danny had done this before, she realized with horror. He knew exactly how to control someone smaller and weaker. They were 20 feet from his car when salvation appeared in an unexpected form. "Hey!" A male voice called from across the parking lot. "What's going on over there?" Danny froze, still holding Maria against his chest. She could feel his heart racing and could smell the expensive cologne mixed with sweat and alcohol. A campus security guard approached, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Officer Reynolds. Maria recognized him from the night shift, an older man who actually cared about student safety, unlike some of the rent-a-cops. "Everything okay here?" Reynolds asked, hand resting on his radio. Danny's grip loosened slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the menace from moments before, just the practiced charm of someone who'd talked his way out of trouble his entire life. "Oh, thank God you're here, officer," Danny said, still holding Maria but making it look supportive rather than restraining. "I found this girl wandering around the parking lot, completely drunk. I was trying to help her get back to her dorm safely." "I'm not drunk." Maria gasped as soon as Danny's hand moved away from her mouth. "He was following me. He grabbed me." Reynolds looked between them, his expression uncertain. Danny Hayden, he knew the name, knew the reputation. Captain Hayden's son, a major donor to the university, someone who could make problems disappear with a phone call. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Reynolds said carefully. Danny smiled, reaching for his wallet with practiced ease. "Of course, officer. I completely understand your concern." As he handed over his license, Danny leaned close to Maria's ear. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words chilled her to the bone. "If you keep making noise, I'll make sure you regret it. I know where you live, where you work, where your little sister goes to high school. One word from my father, and your family's immigration status gets reviewed very carefully." Maria went rigid. Her family had been legal residents for 8 years, but Danny's threat carried weight. Captain Hayden had connections throughout law enforcement, connections that could make life very difficult for a family of immigrants. Actually, Maria said quietly, hating herself for the words, maybe I did have too much to drink tonight. I'm sorry if I seemed confused. Reynolds looked at her with concern. Are you sure, miss? If someone was bothering you, no, it's fine, Maria said, her voice hollow. Danny was just trying to help. The security guard clearly wasn't convinced, but without a complaint from the alleged victim, his hands were tied. Well, let me at least escort you both back to your dorms. That's very kind, Danny said smoothly, but I can make sure Maria gets home safely. I know exactly where Campus Hall is. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right. But I'll be checking back in 20 minutes to make sure everyone made it to their rooms okay. As the guard walked away, Danny's mask slipped back into place. His hand found Maria's arm again, fingers digging in just hard enough to bruise. Good girl, he whispered. You're learning. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to my apartment. You're going to have a few drinks and relax a little. And then you're going to show me just how grateful you are for my help tonight. Please, Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please don't do this. Oh, I'm going to do whatever I want, Danny replied, guiding her toward his car. And you're going to let me. Because if you don't, if you even think about reporting this, I'll destroy your entire family. My father has friends in ICE, friends in the DA's office, and friends who can make people disappear. He opened the passenger door of his BMW, gesturing for her to get in. Maria looked around desperately, but the campus was nearly empty now. No witnesses, no help coming. Get in the car, Maria, Danny said, his voice patient but implacable. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. With shaking hands, Maria climbed into the passenger seat. Danny closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, classical music filled the car, Mozart, played at low volume. See how civilized this can be, Danny said as they drove off campus. You just need to understand how things work in the real world. Sometimes, people like me get to do whatever we want to people like you. It's not personal, it's just the way things are. Maria closed her eyes, praying to saints she hadn't spoken to since childhood. Praying that someone, somewhere, would notice she was missing. That someone would care enough to look for her. But as Danny's BMW disappeared into Star City's night traffic, her prayers seemed to disappear into the darkness with her. Chapter 14, Blue Wall. Star City Police Department, Captain's Office. The next morning, Captain Michael Hayden sat behind his mahogany desk, a cup of black coffee growing cold beside a stack of incident reports he had no intention of reading. At 52, he'd spent 30 years building his kingdom within the Star City Police Department, 30 years learning that power wasn't about justice, it was about control. The morning sun streamed through his office windows, illuminating commendations and photographs that told the story of a distinguished career. Hayden with the mayor at charity functions. Hayden receiving awards for community service. Hayden shaking hands with federal officials who praised his department's cooperation. All of it carefully constructed bullshit. His desk phone buzzed. Captain. His secretary's voice carried the nervous tone everyone used when dealing with him. Detective Lawson is here about the Santos case. Hayden smiled coldly. Right on schedule. Send him in. Detective Eric Lawson entered the office with the swagger of someone who thought he understood how the game was played. 38 years old, 15 years on the force, ambitious enough to be useful but not smart enough to be dangerous. Perfect middle management material. Captain, Lawson said, settling into the chair across from Hayden's desk. About this Maria Santos situation, we might have a problem. Hayden leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled. Explain. Lawson opened his notepad, consulting notes he'd made in careful handwriting. Santos filed a report this morning. Claims she was assaulted last night by a male student. Gave us a description that matches Danny Hayden, the captain finished. My son. Lawson nodded uncomfortably. She's requesting a grape kit, wants to press full charges. Says she has witness testimony from a security guard who saw her being forced into a vehicle. And what did you tell Miss Santos? That we'd investigate thoroughly, of course. But Captain, if this goes to court, Hayden held up a hand, silencing the detective. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out a thick manila folder that landed on the desk with a heavy thud. Lawson's name was written across the tab in neat block letters. Detective Lawson, Hayden said conversationally. How long have you been gambling? Lawson's face went pale. Sir, I don't, offshore betting sites, mostly. Football, basketball, and some horse racing. You're into your bookies for what, $47,000. Hayden opened the folder, scanning pages of printed financial records. Your wife doesn't know, does she? Thinks you've been working overtime to save for little Jenny's college fund. Captain, I don't see how your personal business becomes police business when you start taking bribes to pay your debts, Hayden interrupted, pulling out a series of photographs. Here's you accepting an envelope from Tommy Castellano. Here's you deleting evidence from the Pier 17 drug bust. Here's you tipping off the Morettas about their warehouse raid. Lawson stared at the photographs with growing horror. He'd been so careful, so discreet. The idea that someone had been documenting his activities for months made his stomach turn. Now, Hayden continued, returning the photos to the folder, let's discuss the Santos case. What's going to happen is very simple. You're going to lose her report. Computer malfunction, clerical error, or whatever excuse you prefer. The grape kit will be contaminated during processing. The security guard will remember that he was mistaken about what he saw. Captain, I can't just, you can and you will, Hayden's voice turned icy. Because if you don't, I'll make sure Internal Affairs gets a complete copy of your file. Your wife will learn about your gambling problem when reporters start calling for comments about your corruption charges. Little Jenny will watch her daddy get perp-walked on the evening news. Lawson sat in stunned silence, understanding finally dawning about how deeply he'd been trapped. Every favor he'd done for the Hayden family, every blind eye he'd turned, had been carefully documented and catalogued. Good, Hayden said, interpreting the silence correctly. Now, about Miss Santos specifically. She's going to have some accidents over the next few weeks. Her car will break down in inconvenient places. Her student loans will face unexpected review. Her family's business licenses will require additional scrutiny from various city departments. What if she goes to the media? Hayden laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. A poor immigrant girl accusing the police captain's son of grape? With no physical evidence and no credible witnesses? The media will eat her alive, and she knows it. Lawson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And if she persists anyway? Then she becomes a more serious problem that requires more serious solutions, Hayden replied matter-of-factly. Immigration status is such a fragile thing, detective. One anonymous tip about document irregularities, and an entire family can find themselves facing deportation proceedings. Jesus, Captain, don't get squeamish on me now, Lawson. You've been taking my money for 3 years. You think it came without strings attached. Hayden stood, walking to the window that overlooked the police station's parking lot. Squad cars came and went, officers beginning their shifts, all of them believing they served justice rather than one man's twisted empire. My son is a young man with healthy appetites, Hayden continued, his back to Lawson. Sometimes young men make mistakes when they're drinking, when they're excited. It's not his fault that girls these days don't understand their place in the natural order. Captain, grape isn't a mistake, Hayden spun around, his face contorted with rage. Don't you dare lecture me about grape, you corrupt piece of shit. You want to talk about morality? You've been selling police intelligence to drug dealers for gambling money. You've endangered undercover officers, compromised ongoing investigations, and perverted justice for personal gain. Lawson shrank back in his chair as Hayden advanced around the desk. At least my son takes what he wants honestly, Hayden continued, looming over the detective. You're just a bitch who pretends to have principles between customers. I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but people did get hurt, didn't they? Hayden returned to his desk, pulling out another folder. Officer Patricia Williams was shot during the Pier 17 bust because you warned the dealer she was coming. 3 months in the hospital, permanent nerve damage in her left arm. Also, you could cover a $20,000 basketball bet. Lawson's hands trembled as he stared at the medical reports. He'd convinced himself that his information had been harmless, that he was just helping some bookies avoid minor drug charges. The idea that a fellow cop had been crippled because of his betrayal. "So don't sit in my office talking about right and wrong," Hayden snarled. "You lost that privilege the first time you decided your gambling debts were more important than your oath." The captain returned to his chair, his voice returning to its earlier conversational tone. "Now, the Santos case. You know what needs to happen. Make it go away, make her go away, and we never have to discuss this again." Lawson nodded miserably. "What about the security guard?" "Reynolds. He's been having performance issues lately. Missed some shifts, questionable decision-making. I think early retirement might be in his best interests." Hayden made a note on his desk calendar. "I'll speak with the university administration this afternoon." "And if Santos tries to go around us?" "State police, FBI." "Leave that to me," Hayden said dismissively. "I have friends at every level of law enforcement. Friends who understand that sometimes the greater good requires overlooking individual complaints." Lawson stood to leave, but Hayden's voice stopped him at the door. "Detective? One more thing. My son enjoyed himself last night, but he's young and impulsive. He might want to see Miss Santos again and continue their relationship. When that happens, I want you to make sure there are no distractions. No protective orders, no harassment charges, no interference with their true love. After all, they say, let love breathe or it will suffocate. You want me to help him grape her again?" "I want you to do your job," Hayden replied coldly. "Which is following orders and keeping your mouth shut. Everything else is above your pay grade." As Lawson left the office, Hayden returned to his coffee and incident reports. Another crisis managed, another potential scandal buried. 30 years of building relationships, accumulating favors, and documenting everyone else's corruption had created a web of protection that even his most reckless son couldn't break. Hayden had learned early in his 30-year career that police work was fundamentally about control, controlling narratives, controlling evidence, and controlling outcomes. The public believed in fairy tales about justice and due process, but real police work required understanding that some people were more valuable than others, some crimes were more important than others, and some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. His son Danny was a Hayden, which meant he was family, which meant he was protected by the blue wall that separated cops from civilians. The girls who accused Danny were civilians, which meant their stories were automatically suspect, their credibility questionable, and their motives unclear. His desk phone buzzed again. "Captain? Mayor Wellington on line 2. Hayden smiled, picking up the receiver. The mayor owed him several favors, including some assistance with his own son's drunk driving incidents. "Time to call one in. Jim." Hayden said warmly. "How's the family? I heard Tommy made varsity football." Outside his office, Star City continued its daily routine, unaware that justice was being auctioned to the highest bidder by the men sworn to protect them. In a few hours, Maria Santos would learn that her assault had been deemed unfounded due to lack of evidence. And somewhere in the city, a young woman would begin to understand that the system designed to protect her had been purchased by the very people who wanted to hurt her. But Captain Hayden had been building his empire for 30 years. He'd survived corruption scandals, federal investigations, and reform administrations. He had no way of knowing that his crimes had already been noted by someone who collected evidence the way others collected stamps, methodically, patiently, and with a very specific purpose in mind. Someone who understood that when the system failed completely, justice had to come from outside the system entirely. Chapter 15. The search begins. The Iceberg Lounge, Gotham City, 11:47 p.m. The bass thrummed through the floor of Oswald Cobblepot's establishment, mixing with the clink of expensive glasses and the murmur of conversations that would never be repeated in polite society. Batman moved through the shadows of the VIP section, where Gotham's criminal elite conducted business under the protection of diplomatic immunity and expensive lawyers. Tonight, however, the usual atmosphere of confident corruption felt different. Subdued. Even the most hardened criminals were glancing over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones about Vincent Torino's brutal end. Batman settled into an alcove overlooking the main floor, his cape blending seamlessly with the darkness. Below, Three men sat around a corner table, their body language screaming anxiety despite the alcohol they'd consumed. "Telling you, whoever did Torino knew things," one of them was saying. Mickey Torino, Vincent's younger brother, had inherited what remained of the family's loan shark operation. Knew about the insurance videos, knew about the offshore accounts. That's inside information. "Inside from where?" asked the second man, Carlos Mendez, who ran numbers for the Bertinelli family. Torino didn't trust anybody with that kind of detail. "Maybe someone was watching longer than we thought," suggested the third. Tony Marconi, mid-level enforcer for the Falcone organization. Could be feds, could be rival families. Batman activated the directional microphone built into his cowl, focusing on their conversation while scanning the room for other intelligence opportunities. "It ain't feds," Mickey said, downing his whiskey in one gulp. "Feds don't torture people for hours, don't carve up bodies like some kind of artist. This was personal." "Personal how?" Mendez leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "The way they arranged the bodies, like they were making a statement. And those bone things they left behind? That's some serial killer shit, men. Someone with serious mental problems." Batman's eyes narrowed. The criminals were more frightened than he'd expected, which suggested the killer's message had been received loud and clear throughout Gotham's underworld. "What if it's one of the capes?" Marconi asked, glancing nervously toward the shadows where Batman might be lurking. "What if the Bat finally decided to stop playing games?" "Nah," Mickey shook his head. "Batman doesn't kill. Everyone knows that. This is someone else, someone who doesn't give a shit about rules." "Maybe that's what we need to be worried about," Mendez said. "If it ain't Batman, if it ain't cops, then who's got the juice to take down Torino's whole crew without leaving a trace?" Before anyone could answer, the lights in the VIP section flickered once, Batman's signal that his presence had been detected. He melted back into the shadows, moving toward the club's service corridors. The conversation had confirmed what he'd suspected: the killer was operating outside normal criminal or law enforcement channels. Someone with resources, skills, and most importantly, access to information that should have been highly classified. 20 minutes later, Batman emerged onto the Iceberg Lounge's roof, where he'd arranged to meet one of his most reliable informants. Edward Nashton, the reformed Riddler, stood near the building's edge, his green suit replaced by a modest windbreaker and slacks. "Interesting evening for surveillance," Edward said without turning around. "Though I suspect you learned less than you hoped." "What have you heard about the Torino killings?" Batman asked directly. Edward smiled, the expression visible in the reflection of the building's windows. "Ah, straight to business. I appreciate efficiency." He turned to face Batman, his demeanor serious despite the slight smile. "The word on the street is fear, Batman. Real fear, not the usual bravado these criminals use to mask their anxiety." "Fear of what specifically?" "Fear of the unknown. Vincent Torino was a monster, but he was a predictable monster. He had patterns, weaknesses, and people who could be bought or intimidated. This killer? No one knows their patterns, no one knows their limits, and most importantly, no one knows their target list." Batman processed this information while studying Edward's body language. The former supervillain was genuinely unsettled, which meant the situation was more serious than even Batman had realized. "Have you heard any speculation about identity?" Batman pressed. "Theories, certainly. Some think it's a rival family making a power play. Others suspect federal agents operating off the books. But the smart money, and by smart money, I mean the criminals intelligent enough to survive in this business, they think it's someone completely outside the traditional power structures. Someone with access to police files, federal databases, personal information that should be protected." "Exactly." Edward nodded approvingly. "Someone who understands both criminal psychology and law enforcement procedure. Someone who can anticipate how investigations will unfold and stay ahead of them." Batman filed this insight away. The killer wasn't just intelligent, they were systematically outmaneuvering law enforcement through superior knowledge of police procedure. "There's something else," Edward continued. "Something that might interest you specifically." "Go on." "The bone sculptures, they're not random. Each one represents a specific principle of justice that was violated in the victim's case. Torino's broken scales represent the corruption of legal balance. The other cases I've researched show similar symbolism. Batman's cowl concealed his surprise, but Edward's investigative skills remained sharp even in retirement. You've been researching the other cases? Portland, Cleveland, Detroit. All similar patterns, all involving criminals who escape justice through corruption or legal technicalities. Our killer isn't just eliminating criminals, they're making philosophical statements about the failure of institutional justice. This was exactly the kind of insight Batman needed. The killer wasn't operating from rage or personal vendetta. They were conducting a methodic campaign based on carefully considered principles. Any theories about their next target? Batman asked. Edward's expression darkened. That's what worries me most. If they're working through cases of institutional failure, Gotham provides a target-rich environment. Corrupt judges, bought politicians, criminals with connections, our killer could stay busy for years. Unless they're stopped. The question is whether they should be stopped, Edward said quietly. I'm not advocating vigilante justice, but these weren't random victims. Vincent Torino destroyed dozens of families. The Portland targets were running child prostitution rings. Cleveland involved human trafficking. Batman's jaw tightened. The moment we start deciding who deserves to live or die, we become the very thing we're fighting against. I agree philosophically, Edward replied. But I also understand the appeal of absolute justice when institutional justice fails completely. Edward, Batman said, turning back to his informant. I need you to put out feelers throughout the criminal community. Anyone who's heard rumors about the next target, anyone who's noticed unusual surveillance, anyone who's been approached by someone asking suspicious questions. You think they're already selecting their next victim? I think they're 3 steps ahead of us, Batman admitted grimly. And unless we start anticipating their moves instead of reacting to them, more people are going to die. Edward nodded, understanding the urgency. I'll reach out to my contacts. But Batman? Be careful with this one. Whoever they are, they're not just killing criminals, they're reshaping the entire criminal landscape through fear. As Batman prepared to leave for Star City, Edward's words echoed in his mind. The killer wasn't just eliminating individual targets, they were conducting a campaign of psychological warfare against the entire criminal justice system. The hunt was about to become much more complicated. Chapter 16, The Envelope's Promise. Star City University Campus. 3 days after the police report. Maria Santos sat in the empty sociology classroom, her textbook open to a page she couldn't read. The words kept swimming together, dissolving into meaningless shapes that reminded her of the laughing faces in her nightmares. She'd been staring at the same paragraph for 47 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting everything lately. Minutes, heartbeats, the number of times she checked the locks on doors that wouldn't keep monsters out anyway. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She let it ring, watching the screen light up like a tiny rectangle of hell. When it stopped, she counted to 10 before it started again. They never let her rest. Miss Santos. Maria's head snapped up so fast her neck cracked. Professor Williams stood in the doorway, but her face looked wrong, too concerned, too pitying. Everyone looked at her differently now, like she was broken glass they had to step around carefully. I'm sorry, Maria whispered, though she couldn't remember what she was apologizing for. She apologized for everything now. For existing, for breathing, for taking up space in a world that had made it clear she didn't belong. Professor Williams closed the door and sat beside her. Maria, honey, when was the last time you went home? Or ate something? You look like a victim, Maria finished flatly. Everyone keeps telling me I look like a victim. Funny how that works. Before, I looked like a student. Now I look like what I am. That's not what you are. Yes, it is. Maria's voice was hollow, emptied of everything that used to make it hers. I reported what happened. You know what Detective Lawson told me? He said I seemed confused about the details. Said maybe I'd been drinking, maybe I misunderstood Danny's intentions. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He actually asked me if I was sure I hadn't wanted it. Professor Williams's face went pale. Maria, That's completely inappropriate. Inappropriate, Maria repeated, tasting the word. That's what they called Danny following me for the past few days. Inappropriate. Not stalking. Not predatory behavior. Just inappropriate. She closed her textbook with shaking hands. Do you know what Captain Hayden called it when his son dragged me to his apartment? Boys being boys. The phone buzzed again. Maria stared at it like it was a snake. They call every hour, she said conversationally. Sometimes it's Danny. Sometimes it's his friends. Sometimes they just breathe. Sometimes they describe what they're going to do to my little sister. Her voice never changed tone, never cracked. It was the voice of someone who had screamed until her throat bled and now had nothing left. Carmen's 14. Did you know that? 14 years old, and they have photos of her walking to school. Professor Williams reached for Maria's hand, but Maria pulled away. Touch felt wrong now. Everything felt wrong. There are other options, Professor Williams said desperately. Federal authorities, victim advocacy groups. No. Maria's voice was dead. Captain Hayden was very clear. He has files on my whole family. Immigration status, work permits, and tax records. He knows which days my parents clean which buildings, what time Carmen gets out of school, and where my grandmother lives back in El Salvador. She finally looked at Professor Williams, and her eyes were empty. He told me that deportation proceedings can be very dangerous. That sometimes people disappear during transport. Professor Williams's face crumpled. Oh, honey, I used to believe in the system, Maria continued, as if the other woman hadn't spoken. Constitutional protections, due process, equal treatment under law. I wrote papers about social justice. I was going to be a social worker, help other people navigate the system. She laughed again, that terrible broken sound. Turns out the system works exactly like it's supposed to. It protects the right people from the wrong people. I was just confused about which category I belonged to. After Professor Williams left, fleeing, really, from the wreckage of Maria's shattered faith, Maria remained in the empty classroom as darkness pressed against the windows. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through 17 missed calls from unknown numbers. Each one was a reminder that she had no privacy, no safety, and no power over her own existence. She opened her laptop and searched Danny Hayden's Star City just to torture herself. The search results showed a smiling young man at charity events, academic achievements, and a bright future. The kind of boy mothers pointed to as an example for their daughters to admire. Then she searched Maria Santos' Star City and found nothing. She had been erased as efficiently as if she had never existed. Meanwhile, Hayden family estate Danny Hayden lay sprawled across his father's leather couch, laptop balanced on his chest, live streaming his evening entertainment to a private group chat. On his screen, grainy surveillance footage showed Maria sitting alone in the empty classroom, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Look at this pathetic bitch, he narrated to his audience of equally privileged sociopaths. 3 days since I broke her, and she still thinks there's some way out. His viewers responded with laughing emojis and increasingly vile suggestions for his next move. Captain Hayden entered the study carrying a scotch and a manila folder thick with photographs. Still playing with your food? She's barely hanging on, Danny said proudly. I give her maybe another week before she does something stupid. Suicide, maybe, or a complete psychotic break. Either way, problem solved. Captain Hayden settled into his chair and opened the folder. I've been reviewing her family's documentation. Her parents' work permits expire next month. One anonymous tip about tax evasion and immigration enforcement becomes very interested in their activities. Danny grinned, angling his laptop camera to show his father. Chat, say hello to the man who makes it all possible. Captain Mike Hayden, 26 years of keeping scum like the Santos family in their place. The chat exploded with approval. Captain Hayden raised his glass to the camera in a mock salute. The beauty of our position, Captain Hayden said, is that everything appears legitimate. Maria Santos filed a report alleging assault. We investigated thoroughly and found insufficient evidence. Case closed. If she chooses to make false accusations on social media or to journalists, well, that's defamation of character against a police captain's family. Very serious charges. And if she tries to transfer schools, her transcripts will reflect a pattern of psychological instability and false accusations. No reputable institution would accept that liability. Captain Hayden pulled out a photograph of Carmen walking to school, unaware she was being followed. Besides, her family can't afford to relocate. They're trapped by money as much as by law. Danny switched his camera to the surveillance feed. Look at her. Chat. She thinks she's alone, but we see everything. We hear everything. We control everything. He zoomed in on Maria's tear-stained face. This is what powerlessness looks like. This is what happens when inferior people forget their place. The chat erupted with increasingly violent suggestions. Danny laughed, reading them aloud for his father's amusement. Some of these guys want to crowdsource the next assault, Danny said. Turn it into a real event. What do you think, Dad? Could we arrange something? Captain Hayden considered this seriously. Not yet. She needs to be completely broken first. Right now, she might still fight back or try to run. We want her catatonic with fear, grateful for whatever small mercies we allow her. How long do you think that'll take? Another week, maybe 2. Then we can really have some fun. Maria's apartment, 2:17 a.m. Maria sat on her bedroom floor, back against the wall, staring at her phone. It had been buzzing for 23 minutes straight, different numbers, same message. They wanted her to know they could reach her anywhere, anytime, and that sleep was a privilege they could revoke at will. She'd stuffed towels under her door so the sound wouldn't wake her family. Carmen had school in the morning. Her parents had another 16-hour shift cleaning offices. They needed their rest and needed to believe their daughter was safe in the country they'd sacrificed everything to reach. The call stopped at 2:31 a.m. Maria counted the seconds of silence, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, waiting for them to start again. When they didn't, the quiet felt worse than the ringing. At least when they were actively tormenting her, she knew where they were. She opened her laptop and typed "how to disappear completely" into the search engine. The results were pathetic: identity theft protection services, social media privacy settings, and articles about digital detoxing. Nothing about how to escape from monsters who had the entire system working for them. Then she tried suicide methods and stared at the page for a long time. It would be easier. For everyone. Danny would find a new victim, her family wouldn't have to live in fear, and she wouldn't have to carry the weight of her powerlessness anymore. But even that choice had been taken from her. Captain Hayden had made it clear what would happen to her family if she tried to escape, even through death. They would be blamed for driving her to it. Immigration violations would be discovered. Carmen would be interrogated about what she knew, when she knew it, and why she hadn't reported her sister's obvious mental illness. Maria closed the laptop and pulled her knees to her chest. She was trapped in a cage made of other people's vulnerability, and every struggle to escape only tightened the bars. The next morning, Star City University Library. Maria hadn't slept. She'd come to campus before dawn and hidden in the library's basement, surrounded by books about hope and justice and social change, concepts that belonged to a world she no longer inhabited. Her phone showed 47 missed calls from the night. She'd stopped counting somewhere around 30, when the numbers started to blur together like everything else in her life. Around noon, she became aware of someone watching her. An elderly woman sat at a nearby table, reading a newspaper, but her eyes kept drifting to Maria with an expression of deep sadness. The woman was well dressed in a way that suggested money without flashiness, expensive clothes worn with the comfort of someone who had never worried about being judged by her appearance. She looked like the kind of grandmother who attended PTA meetings and organized charity drives, the kind of person who believed in fairness and justice because the system had always worked for her. "Excuse me, dear." Maria's head snapped up, her body tensing for flight. Everyone was a potential threat now. Everyone could be working for them. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the woman said gently. "I'm Margaret. Margaret Green. I couldn't help but notice, you look like someone who's lost hope entirely." Maria stared at her, trying to process words that sounded like kindness but could be another trap. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Margaret's voice was soft but certain. "You look like someone who's discovered that the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. And you weren't supposed to be one of the people it protects." The words hit Maria like physical blows. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Who are you? I'm someone who understands what it's like to be completely powerless, Margaret said, moving to sit across from Maria despite not being invited. To realize that every authority figure you were taught to trust is either corrupt or complicit. To know that your suffering entertains the people who destroyed you. Maria's vision blurred. You don't know anything about me. I know you reported a crime and were told you were lying. I know the person who hurt you is protected by someone with power. I know you've been threatened not just with your own destruction but with harm to everyone you love. Margaret's voice never changed, never became dramatic or emotional. She spoke like someone reciting facts. I know you've realized that justice is a fairy tale told to keep people like you from fighting back. Stop. Maria's voice broke. Please stop. I know you've considered ending your own life, but even that escape has been taken from you because they've made your family part of the equation. Margaret reached into her purse. And I know you're sitting here researching ways to disappear because you don't understand yet that there is another option. She placed a black envelope on the table between them. The paper was expensive, formal, and sealed with dark red wax. The seal bore the impression of broken scales. What is that? Maria whispered. It's proof that you're not as powerless as you think, Margaret said simply. The system failed you completely. But the system isn't the only form of justice that exists. Maria stared at the envelope like it might explode. I don't understand. You don't have to understand yet. But you have to choose. Margaret stood, gathering her things. You can accept what's been done to you, live in fear for the rest of your shortened life, and watch the same thing happen to other girls. Or you can seek a different kind of justice. What kind of justice? Maria asked desperately. The kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that doesn't care about due process or reasonable doubt or political connections. Margaret's eyes were sad but certain. The kind that makes monsters afraid. Who are you? Maria called out as Margaret began to leave. I'm someone who was failed by the system a long time ago, Margaret replied. And I learned that sometimes, when official justice is impossible, unofficial justice becomes necessary. After Margaret left, Maria sat staring at the black envelope for hours. Students came and went around her, living their normal lives in a world where justice was still possible, where reporting crimes still mattered, where powerful people couldn't destroy you for sport. She thought about Danny's laughing face, about Captain Hayden's threats, about the system that had not only abandoned her but actively participated in her destruction. She thought about Carmen, still believing in constitutional protections. She thought about other girls, girls who were being stalked right now, girls who would be dragged to apartments and broken for entertainment, girls whose families would be threatened into silence. She didn't hope for justice anymore. Hope was a luxury for people who still believed the world made sense. But she was curious about what happened when someone stopped caring about rules that had never protected them anyway. The broken scales on the envelope caught the streetlight as she walked home, and Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Not hope, she was too broken for hope. But interest in what came after hope died. Maybe that was enough. For those confused about why MC didn't help her earlier, Arc 1 and this particular situation happened around the same time. Captain Hayden is one of the links he got from the Arc 1 villains. This chapter is a little intense. I strongly condemn Grape and do not agree with any of the viewpoints of Danny written below. Neither should you. We do not excuse monsters. We don't become them. We remain human, even when life dares us not to. Chapter 17. Pray. Star City University Campus. Late night. Danny Hayden checked his Rolex. 11:52 p.m. Perfect timing. Danny Hayden crouched behind the dumpster in the alley adjacent to Starling University's main campus, his breathing shallow with excitement as he watched groups of female students walking back to their dorms after late-night study sessions. At 26, he'd perfected his hunting grounds, the poorly lit pathways between academic buildings and residential areas where security cameras had convenient blind spots and campus security made predictable rounds. His father's police captain badge had taught him valuable lessons about power, authority, and the beautiful simplicity of systems that protected those who knew how to work them. Captain Robert Hayden of the Star City Police Department had been Danny's hero, his mentor, and his shield against consequences for over 8 years of predation. But Danny had learned his lessons well. The Hayden family understood that rules were for other people, that badges and uniforms were magic talismans that transformed crimes into misunderstandings, victims into unreliable witnesses, and grape into, she said, situations that juries rarely prosecuted successfully. He'd been watching Maria Santos for 3 days, learning her new patterns. The broken little bitch thought she was being clever, varying her routes and staying in public areas. But Danny had resources she couldn't imagine. Campus security footage, student ID tracking, even her library computer logs. Daddy's connections reached everywhere. Danny had been perfecting his method for 8 years, ever since his 18th birthday, when his father had explained the facts of life with brutal clarity. Son, there are 2 kinds of people in this world, wolves and sheep. The sheep think the system protects them, but the system is run by wolves. As long as you're my boy, you're protected. Just be smart about it. Being smart meant choosing victims carefully. College girls from out of state whose families weren't connected to local politics. Working class girls who couldn't afford lawyers. International students who were afraid of deportation. Girls with drinking problems or mental health issues whose credibility could be questioned in court. Being smart meant learning the system's weaknesses. How evidence disappeared from lockup. How case files got misfiled or accidentally destroyed. How witnesses could be intimidated into changing their testimony or failing to appear in court. How district attorneys could be convinced that certain cases weren't worth prosecuting. Being smart meant understanding that grape wasn't about sex, it was about power. The power to take what you wanted from someone weaker. The power to destroy innocence and replace it with trauma. The power to walk away clean while your victim spent years in therapy trying to rebuild her shattered psyche. Predictable, he murmured, lighting a cigarette as he watched her exit the library. Same oversized hoodie, same nervous glances, same pathetic attempt at confidence. The sociology building was her next stop, always was on Thursdays. She'd hole up in the study room until 2 a.m., pretending to work while actually just hiding from the world. From him. Danny smiled. She had no idea how much worse her life was about to get. The past few days had been delicious. Maria jumping at every shadow, checking over her shoulder, that constant edge of terror in her eyes. But she was getting too comfortable. Starting to think maybe he'd lost interest, maybe Daddy's threats had been enough. Time to correct that misconception. He followed at a distance, savoring the anticipation. This was the best part, the hunt. The moment when prey realized they'd never actually escaped. Maria's pace quickened as she noticed his footsteps. Danny grinned wider. She was learning. You can run, Maria, he called out softly, just loud enough for her to hear. But you can't hide forever. She broke into a sprint. Danny laughed, not bothering to chase. Why rush? He knew exactly where she was going. The sociology building had security cameras, but they'd been malfunctioning for weeks. It's amazing what Daddy's connections could arrange. He took his time, enjoying his cigarette. Let her think she'd gotten away. Let her feel that brief moment of relief before he shattered it completely. The building was dark when he arrived, but he knew she was inside. Probably in the 3rd floor study room, probably crying. They always cried when they realized the truth, that there was nowhere to run, no one to save them, and no system that would protect them from people like him. Danny had been doing this for years. Portland, Cleveland, Detroit, always the same pattern. Find the vulnerable ones, the ones who couldn't fight back, who had something to lose if they talked. Break them down slowly, methodically, until they understood their place in the natural order. And if they got too difficult? Well, accidents happen. Suicides were surprisingly common among traumatized college students. He found the study room easily, dim light seeping under the door. Danny paused, straightening his jacket, checking his appearance in the window's reflection. It's important to look good for these moments. First impressions mattered after all. He paused outside, savoring the anticipation. This was always the best part, the moment when prey realized they'd never actually escaped. When they understood that all their precautions, all their little attempts at safety, were just illusions. The door wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. Maria was too broken to think clearly anymore. She was sitting at the far corner, back to the door, hunched over her books. The same position he'd seen her in for days, small, defeated, trying to disappear. Hello, Maria, Danny said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Miss me?" No response. She didn't turn, didn't even flinch. "You know," Danny continued, moving closer, "I've been thinking about our last conversation. About how ungrateful you were. How you tried to involve people who couldn't help you. Still nothing. Usually they would be begging by now, or at least crying. The silent treatment? Really?" He laughed. "That's fine. We have all night to work through your attitude problem." He reached out to grab her shoulder, to spin her around so she could see his face, see the promise of what was coming. The figure turned on its own. Maria's face looked back at him, but the eyes were wrong. Too calm. Too knowing. Like she was seeing something fascinating instead of terrifying. "Hello, Danny," she said softly. But the voice was wrong too. Not scared. Not broken. Almost pleased. Danny's hand froze inches from her shoulder. Something was very, very wrong. "I've been waiting for you," Maria continued, and when she smiled, her teeth seemed too sharp in the dim light. "We have so much to discuss." The MC's shapeshifting ability only requires a sample of the target's DNA, unlike in Prototype, where consuming the victim is necessary. However, he doesn't gain any memories from the transformation. Chapter 18. Family Reunion. The abandoned warehouse in Gotham's industrial district had seen better days. Rusted metal beams groaned under their own weight, and broken windows let in shards of pale moonlight. Danny Hayden hung suspended from chains, his wrists raw and bleeding, consciousness flickering like a dying light bulb. Alex Thorne stood in the shadows, his form rippling as he maintained Maria's appearance. The shape-shifting felt natural now, like slipping into comfortable clothes. Every detail was perfect, her height, her voice, even the tremor of fear she'd carried since that night on campus. "Danny," Alex called softly, his voice Maria's broken whisper. "Wake up." Danny's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and panicked. When he saw Maria standing before him, his confusion twisted into that familiar dirty grin. Well, Danny slurred through split lips. "Come back for more? I knew you liked it rough." Alex smiled with Maria's face, but the expression held nothing human. "I brought someone to meet you." Heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse as Captain Hayden stumbled into the dim light, his hand zip-tied behind his back, duct tape across his mouth. His police uniform was torn and stained, his eyes wide with terror above the silver tape. "Dad." Danny's voice cracked. "What the hell? Shh." Alex placed a finger to Maria's lips. "Family time." The biomass rippled beneath Alex's skin as he began to shift, Maria's form dissolving like melting wax. Bones cracked and reformed, muscles expanded and contracted, until Alex stood in his true form, tall, lean, with eyes that held the accumulated darkness of every memory he'd consumed. "My name is Architect," he said, his voice now cold and clinical. "I've been looking forward to this psychology lesson." Danny thrashed against his chains. "You're that freak. The one who killed Vincent." Vincent Torino was still practice. Alex circled Danny like a predator studying prey. "You two are the real lesson." He pressed his palm against Danny's forehead. The contact burned like ice, and Danny's screams echoed through the warehouse as Alex's tendrils invaded his mind, consuming every memory, every twisted thought, and every moment of sadistic pleasure. Alex experienced it all, the live streams, the laughter, and the betting pools on how long Maria would last before breaking completely. He felt Danny's excitement at the surveillance photos, the plans for group assault, and the casual discussion of eventually killing her when they got bored. But most importantly, he absorbed Danny's memories of his victims. All of them. The girls from high school. The college students. The ones who never reported. The ones who tried to report and were silenced. Alex pulled his hand away, and Danny hung limp, drooling and vacant-eyed. "Now," Alex turned to Captain Hayden, ripping the tape from his mouth. "Let's discuss your parenting methods." "Please," Hayden gasped. "I can pay you. Name your price." "Payment." Alex laughed, the sound echoing off rusted metal. "Captain, you've already paid. 30 years of corruption. Along with hundreds of buried cases and a dozen of officers blackmailed. 3 women dead because you sold police intelligence." Alex pressed his hand to Hayden's temple, and the captain's screams joined the warehouse's chorus of decay. Every bribe. Every covered-up crime. Every life destroyed by corruption. Alex consumed it all. When he finished, both father and son hung unconscious, their minds shattered by experiencing their victim's trauma through Alex's neurological manipulation. They felt every moment of fear, every second of helplessness, and every instant of violation they had caused others. But Alex wasn't finished. He began to reshape his biomass, forming weapons from his own flesh. Bone spurs emerged from his knuckles. His fingers extended into razor-sharp claws. Muscle fibers wove themselves into organic whips that dripped with paralytic toxins. The beauty of psychology, Alex said conversationally as he began his work, is understanding exactly how to make someone break. For the next 3 hours, Alex methodically dismantled them. Not just physically, though the warehouse floor grew slick with blood, but psychologically. He made them experience every emotion their victims had felt, amplified through his enhanced neurology. He made Danny feel the terror of being stalked across campus. The helplessness of having no one believe you. The violation of intimate assault played out in an endless loop. He made Captain Hayden experience the desperation of watching his system fail. The rage of knowing justice was for sale. The hollow ache of betrayal by those sworn to protect. All the violations his son did. When it was over, Alex stood among the carnage, his biomass already beginning to clean itself of blood and bone fragments. He arranged the remains carefully, Danny's body forming one side of a scale, Hayden's the other, perfectly balanced on a fulcrum made of bone fragments. On the warehouse wall, written in blood mixed with calcium deposits from his own transformed skeleton, Alex left his message: "The scales of justice are broken. I am the balance." Below it, mathematical equations describing the psychological impact of institutional betrayal. Chemical formulas for the neurological pathways of trauma. Detailed anatomical notes on the relationship between fear and justice. As sirens wailed in the distance, Alex had called them himself using Captain Hayden's phone. He shifted his form one final time. By the time the first patrol car arrived, Alex had already vanished into the city's shadows, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of fear. In her dorm room across the city, Maria Santos slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, though she didn't yet know why. The black envelope on her nightstand had dissolved into ash, its promise fulfilled. Justice, Alex reflected as he walked through the night, wasn't about what people deserved. It was about what they could survive. And he was just getting started. Chapter 19. Cross-City Investigation. The Watchtower communications room and various locations across Star City and Gotham. The holographic display flickered to life, casting blue light across Batman's cowled face as Green Arrow's image materialized in the Watchtower secure communication chamber. Behind Oliver Queen, the Star City skyline burned with the amber glow of streetlights, while behind Bruce, Gotham's perpetual gloom seemed to swallow even the Batcave's advanced lighting. "Two cities, same killer," Oliver said without preamble, his voice tight with frustration. "Your forensics match ours." Batman's fingers danced across the holographic interface, pulling up crime scene photos that made even seasoned heroes pause. Identical methodology. MO matches. The Hayden scene was. Oliver trailed off, studying the photographs of the makeshift scales. "Christ, Bruce. This isn't just murder. It's performance art." "Psychological warfare," Batman corrected. Each scene with different thesis statements. The killer isn't just eliminating targets, they're making arguments about institutional failure. Oliver leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his beard. What kind of person does this? Batman pulled up a psychological profile he'd been constructing. Someone with intimate knowledge of trauma psychology. Medical or forensic training, possibly doctoral level. Access to police databases and federal records. And most importantly, he paused, highlighting specific details from the crime scenes. Someone who's been planning this for years. Years. I found similar murders dating back 18 months across multiple cities. Portland, Cleveland, Detroit, and now Gotham and Star City. Always targeting corruption networks that escape justice through institutional protection. Batman's voice grew darker. But there's an escalation pattern. The killer is working up to something bigger. Oliver studied the data stream flowing across his screen. The memory extraction, that's not normal psychology training. No. Batman's expression grew grim behind his cowl. The killer somehow accesses their victims' memories. Complete knowledge of their crimes, their networks, and their secrets. Knowledge that should be impossible to obtain. This is the most plausible explanation. Enhanced interrogation? Hypnotism. Beyond that, based on witness statements and crime scene analysis, the killer knows things only the victims themselves could know. Private conversations, hidden locations, encrypted financial records. Batman pulled up another file. I've identified multiple potential next targets based on the memory networks revealed at each scene. Oliver whistled low. Multiple. The Torino and Hayden networks were just the beginning. Based on the killer's research files, they've mapped corruption webs spanning 5 major cities. Police captains, judges, federal prosecutors, city councilmen, an entire shadow government of judicial protection for violent criminals. And you think they're going after all of them? Batman nodded grimly. Systematically. One network at a time. But here's what concerns me most. He highlighted specific crime scene photos. The killer is learning. Each murder is more sophisticated than the last. More psychological. More brutal. Oliver studied the progression of images. They're refining their technique. Like a doctoral thesis. Each kill is an experiment in applied psychology and institutional critique. Batman's voice carried a note of reluctant admiration. Whoever this is, they understand criminal behavior better than most professionals out there. So how do we stop them? Batman's smile was cold and calculating. We think like they do. The killer operates on psychological principles: profile, predict, and control. They study their targets extensively before striking. He pulled up building schematics and surveillance footage. I've identified 3 high-probability next targets based on the evidence revealed at the Hayden scene. Detective Reynolds covered up multiple assault cases for Captain Hayden. Judge Morgan dismissed 17 cases involving violent crimes in exchange for political favors. Federal prosecutor Davidson buried interstate trafficking investigations to protect connected criminals. You're setting traps. Psychological traps. Batman highlighted specific locations on the holographic display. Each potential target is being monitored with advanced sensors designed to detect unusual biological activity. The killer has demonstrated something similar to shape-shifting abilities at the Hayden scene. Several witnesses reported seeing Maria Santos, but she was confirmed to be in her dorm room during the murders. Oliver's eyebrows rose. Shape-shifting. The implications are disturbing. If the killer can assume any identity, traditional surveillance becomes useless. Batman pulled up technical specifications. I've developed some basic bioscanners that can detect shapeshifters similar to Martian Manhunter. If the killer approaches any of our monitored targets, we'll know. What about innocent people caught in the crossfire? Batman's expression darkened. That's what concerns me most. The killer demonstrates clear moral boundaries, only targets those who've escaped justice through corruption. But we should proceed with the assumption that their methods might completely disregard collateral damage. Oliver studied the tactical analysis scrolling across his screen. Military training? Possibly. Batman pulled up autopsy reports. Each kill is precise, calculated to cause maximum psychological impact while ensuring target elimination. The killer understands exactly how to break someone mentally before destroying them physically. You sound like you admire them. Batman's silence stretched uncomfortably long. I understand them. That's what makes them dangerous. Bruce. The killer's research files included preliminary profiles on major Gotham villains: Joker, Two-Face, Penguin, Riddler. Batman's voice grew quieter. Whoever this is, they've been studying my rogues gallery. Learning from them. Oliver felt a chill run down his spine. You think they're planning to go after the big players? I think they're preparing for war. Batman highlighted the final crime scene photo, the message written in blood. The scales of justice are broken. I am the balance. This sentence isn't just about individual criminals, Oliver. This is about the current corrupt system out there. And they've appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner, with the skills and knowledge to actually succeed. Batman's expression was grim. The corruption networks they've exposed represent decades of judicial failure. Cases that should have been prosecuted, criminals who should have been imprisoned, victims who should have received justice. Oliver leaned forward. You almost sound sympathetic. I am. Batman's admission hung heavy in the digital space between them. That's why they're so dangerous. Their cause is just. Their methods are effective. And their targets are genuinely evil people who escaped consequences through corruption. But crossing the line into murder changes everything. No matter how justified the cause, once you start killing, you become the very thing you claim to fight against. Batman's voice carried hard-won wisdom. I've walked that line, Oliver. I know how easy it is to step over. Oliver nodded slowly. So we stop them before they go too far. We try. Batman highlighted the trap locations on the holographic display. But remember, this killer has stayed ahead of law enforcement across 4 cities for 18 months or more. They're intelligent, resourceful, and completely committed to their mission. Any idea what their endgame is? Batman pulled up a final file, pages of research notes recovered from the crime scenes. Based on their current psychological profiles and target selection, I believe they're building towards something catastrophic. The individual murders are just preparation. For what? War. Batman's voice was barely above a whisper. Complete institutional collapse, followed by their version of justice rising from the ashes. Oliver stared at the data stream, feeling the weight of implication. How long do we have? Based on the escalation pattern? Weeks. Maybe less. Maybe more. Anything is possible in cases like this. Batman's image flickered as he prepared to end the transmission. The traps are set, Oliver. But remember, we're not just hunting a killer. We're hunting someone who genuinely believes they're saving the world. And that makes them more dangerous than any psychopath. Infinitely. Batman's image dissolved into static. Because they might be right. As the communication ended, Oliver Queen sat alone in his Star City headquarters, staring at crime scene photos that would haunt his dreams. Somewhere in the darkness between cities, a killer with the knowledge of a scholar and the skills of a predator was preparing their next lesson in applied justice. And the only question remaining was whether Batman's traps would catch them, or whether they were walking into a trap of their own. In Star City's shadows, Alex Thorne smiled as he reviewed the memories he'd absorbed from the Hayden network. Detective Reynolds, Judge Morgan, and Federal Prosecutor Davidson, each name came with detailed psychological profiles, personal weaknesses, and comprehensive knowledge of their crimes. Batman will surely show up tomorrow, he mused. If he couldn't even piece this together, he was never Batman to begin with. The Dark Knight is intelligent, Alex admitted. But intelligence is just another form of pattern recognition. And Alex had been studying patterns his entire life.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.